The December wind whipped through the ruins of what had once been Diagon Alley's most prosperous block, carrying with it the acrid smell of lingering dark magic and the sounds of reconstruction. Harry Potter adjusted his work robes against the chill and surveyed the progress they'd made on Ollivander's shopfront. 7 months after the Battle of Hogwarts, the wizarding world was slowly healing, but the scars ran deep. "Pass me that support beam, Harry," called Ernie Macmillan, his Hufflepuff tie now replaced by the practical brown robes of the Ministry's Reconstruction Corps. "We'll have the Wandmaker back in business by Christmas if we keep this pace." Harry levitated the charred wooden beam into position, his movements automatic after months of this work. At 18, he could have pursued any career he wanted, Aura training, professional Quidditch, even a comfortable position, trading on his fame as the boy who lived. Instead, he found purpose in these ruins, rebuilding the world Voldemort had tried to destroy. The tawny owl arrived without ceremony, landing on a pile of debris near Harry's feet. It extended its leg with the practiced patience of a Gringotts courier, and Harry's stomach tightened as he recognized the distinctive parchment and crimson wax seal bearing the bank's coat of arms. "Official business?" Ernie asked, pausing in his work. Harry broke the seal and unfolded the letter, his green eyes scanning the precise Goblin script. His frown deepened with each line. "Mr. H.J. Potter, your presence is requested at Gringotts Wizarding Bank at your earliest convenience regarding urgent matters pertaining to Potter Vault 687. Our audit department has uncovered irregularities in inheritance records dating to October 31st, 1981, that require immediate clarification. Please present yourself to Senior Account Manager Ragnok No, later than December 15th, 1998. Respectfully, Gringotts Wizarding Bank, Goblin Nation. Everything all right?" Ernie's voice seemed to come from very far away. Harry folded the letter carefully, his mind racing. October 31st, 1981. The night his parents died. He'd accessed his vault regularly since starting Hogwarts, withdrawing modest amounts for school supplies and living expenses. Hagrid had told him about the small fortune his parents left him, and that had always seemed sufficient explanation. What irregularities could there possibly be after 17 years? "I need to step away for a bit," Harry said, already disapparating before Ernie could respond. The familiar marble interior of Gringotts greeted him with its usual bustle of activity, though Harry noticed the increased security measures implemented since the dragon's escape. Sphinxes lounged near the high-security vault entrances, their golden eyes following every customer with calculating intelligence. Harry approached the main desk, where a goblin clerk looked up with the species' characteristic blend of courtesy and barely concealed contempt for wizard kind. "I'm here to see Ragnok," Harry said, presenting the letter. "About Potter Vault 687. The goblin's expression shifted to one of recognition mixed with something that might have been respect. "Senior Account Manager Ragnok has been expecting you, Mr. Potter. 3rd corridor, Office 17. Harry made his way through the increasingly narrow corridors that led deeper into the bank's administrative levels. He'd never ventured this far into Gringotts' bureaucratic heart before, and the weight of centuries seemed to press down through the stone ceiling above. Office 17 bore a simple nameplate, reading Ragnok, Senior Account Manager, in both English and what Harry assumed was gobbledygook. He knocked twice and entered at the gruff invitation from within. Ragnok was older than Griphook had been, his weathered features speaking of decades spent in the bank's service. His office walls were lined with ledgers and filing cabinets that seemed to stretch impossibly high, and the desk between them was carved from a single piece of what looked like black marble veined with silver. "Mr. Potter," Ragnok said, his voice carrying the gravelly undertones common to his species. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." Harry settled into the chair across from the desk, noting how it seemed sized for human visitors despite the goblin architecture surrounding it. "Your letter mentioned irregularities with my vault. I don't understand. I've been accessing it for years without any problems." Ragnok opened a thick ledger and turned it so Harry could see the entries. The pages were covered in meticulous records dating back decades, with columns for deposits, withdrawals, and what appeared to be inheritance transfers. "Your vault, Mr. Potter, contains far more than the small fortune you were told about," Ragnok said, his black eyes fixed intently on Harry's face. "According to our records, James Potter inherited not merely his family's personal wealth when Fleamont and Euphemia Potter died in 1979, but also stewardship of multiple lordship accounts connected to your bloodline." Harry stared at the ledger, the numbers swimming before his eyes. "Lordship accounts?" 23 of them, to be precise, Ragnok continued, his tone growing grimmer. "All systematically emptied, beginning on October 31st, 1981, the very night your parents died. Someone has been stealing from you for 17 years, Mr. Potter, and they've been very careful about it." The office seemed to grow colder. Harry's lightning bolt scar gave a faint twinge, not the sharp pain of Voldemort's presence, but something altogether different, the echo of old magic stirring. "But how is that possible?" Harry asked. "I mean, I was just a baby. Hagrid brought me to my aunt and uncle's house that night. Who could have accessed the vaults?" Ragnok turned several pages in the ledger, revealing authorization forms bearing official seals and signatures. "That, Mr. Potter, is precisely what we intend to find out. The theft was not crude. Whoever did this had intimate knowledge of Goblin banking procedures and access to high-level ministry authorization codes. This was not the work of common thieves." Harry studied the documents, recognizing some of the family names from his years at Hogwarts, houses he'd heard mentioned in whispered conversations about the Sacred 28, families whose children had sat at the Slytherin table with expressions of inherited superiority. "You said 23 lordships," Harry said slowly. "That's nearly all of the most prominent pure-blood families." "Indeed." Ragnok's expression was unreadable. "And the theft wasn't limited to your holdings, Mr. Potter. Our audit has revealed a pattern of inheritance manipulation affecting multiple families, whose heirs were either too young or too incapacitated to notice the discrepancies. You were simply the most prominent victim." The implications hit Harry like a physical blow. While he'd grown up in cupboard under the stairs, believing himself unwanted and worthless, his rightful inheritance had been systematically looted. The money that could have provided for his care, his education, his entire life, stolen while he slept in Privet Drive. "What do you need from me?" Harry asked, his voice steady, despite the fury building in his chest. "Your authorization to conduct a full investigation," Ragnok replied. "Under Goblin law, we have the authority to trace these thefts and recover what was stolen, but we need the primary heir's consent to proceed. Be warned, Mr. Potter, this investigation will uncover uncomfortable truths about some very powerful families. Are you prepared for that?" Harry thought of his parents, murdered in their prime while trying to protect him. He thought of the years of neglect and abuse he'd suffered, while his stolen inheritance could have provided him with a different life entirely. Most of all, he thought of other victims who might still be suffering, while the thieves lived in luxury built on stolen wealth. "Yes," he said firmly, "I want to know everything, and I want justice for everyone they stole from." Ragnok's severe features curved into what might have been a smile. "Very good, Mr. Potter. Then we begin immediately. But understand, Once we start down this path, there will be no turning back. The Goblin Nation takes theft from our vaults very seriously indeed." As Harry signed the authorization papers, his neat signature joining the documents that would unravel 17 years of carefully hidden crimes, he felt a strange sense of destiny settling around him. The war against Voldemort had ended, but it seemed his fight for justice was just beginning. Outside Ragnarok's office, the sounds of Gringotts continued as usual, the scratch of quills on parchment, the clink of gold changing hands, the whispered conversations of wizards conducting their financial business. But Harry knew that beneath this facade of normalcy, a reckoning was coming that would shake the foundations of wizarding society itself. The boy who had defeated the Dark Lord was about to discover that some forms of evil wore respectable faces and hid behind ancient family names. And this time, there would be no convenient prophecy to guide him, only the stark mathematics of theft and the Goblin Nation's unwavering commitment to justice. The cart ride to Potter Vault 687 felt different this time. Where Harry had once marveled at the speed and the dragon-guarded depths, now he studied every tunnel junction and security measure with new eyes. Ragnarok sat opposite him, a leather satchel of audit documents balanced on his lap, his expression grimmer than any goblin Harry had ever encountered. "How many times have you accessed your vault, Mr. Potter?" Ragnarok asked, as their cart rounded a sharp bend, the walls rushing past in a blur of torch-lit stone. "Maybe a dozen times since I started Hogwarts," Harry replied, adjusting his glasses against the rushing wind. "Always just withdrew what I needed for school supplies and books. Hagrid told me my parents left me enough to get by, and that seemed right." "What you withdrew," Ragnarok said carefully, "represents perhaps 1% of what should rightfully be yours." The cart began to slow as they approached the familiar corridor that housed the Potter Vault. Harry's small gold key felt heavier in his hand than it ever had before, and when they finally stopped, the vault door itself seemed somehow different. More imposing, older, as if it held secrets he'd never suspected. Ragnarok produced a second key from his satchel, this one larger and made of what looked like black iron, marked with runic symbols. "Standard protocol requires both the heir's key and a senior manager's audit key to access the deeper chambers," he explained. "You've only ever seen the antechamber, Mr. Potter." "Deeper chambers?" Harry stared at the vault door, which he'd always assumed led to a single room filled with the golden galleons, silver sickles, and bronze knuts his parents had left him. "The Potter family vault is one of the oldest at Gringotts," Ragnarok said, inserting both keys simultaneously. "Dating back to the 14th century. What you've been accessing is merely the family spending account." The door swung open with a sound like distant thunder, revealing not the familiar pile of coins Harry expected, but a short corridor lined with additional doors. The antechamber he'd known, the room with the modest fortune in loose change, was just the first of 7 chambers. "This is impossible," Harry breathed, following Ragnarok into the corridor. "I've been here so many times. How could I not have seen goblin magic?" Ragnarok replied simply. "The chambers are concealed unless both keys are present. Your parents likely never intended for you to access the full inheritance until you came of age." His voice carried a note of anger. "They certainly never intended for it to be looted while you remained ignorant." The second chamber nearly brought Harry to his knees. Where the antechamber had contained a comfortable but modest pile of coins, this room was filled with treasure that would have made the goblins of legend weep with joy. Towers of galleons rose to the vaulted ceiling, precious gems spilled from ornate chests, and ancient artifacts glittered under the magical lighting. But more than the wealth itself, it was the ledger Ragnarok opened that truly staggered Harry. "According to our records," the goblin said, running a gnarled finger down columns of figures, Your father James inherited not merely the Potter family fortune when Fleamont and Euphemia Potter died in 1979, but stewardship accounts for 17 lordships connected to your bloodline through marriage alliances, ancient pacts, and blood inheritance. Harry stared at the ledger entries, many written in the precise script he'd seen in Ragnarok's office. 17? But you said 23 had been stolen. The Potter accounts represent 17 of the 23, Ragnarok confirmed, turning to another section of the ledger. The remaining 6 belong to other families whose heirs were similarly vulnerable. Children orphaned during the First War with the Dark Lord, adults who were incapacitated or imprisoned, estates left in ministry custody. The third chamber contained something that made Harry's breath catch entirely. Portraits. Dozens of them, all bearing faces that carried subtle echoes of his father's features or his mother's eyes. These were his ancestors, the Lords and Ladies Potter, stretching back centuries, and they were all watching him with expressions of barely contained fury. "Young Harry," said a stern-faced witch in Tudor-era robes, her painted eyes flashing. "Finally come to claim what's yours, have you? About bloody time." "Language, Dorea," chided a wizard, from what appeared to be the 18th century. The boys had no idea what was being stolen from under his nose. "No idea?" The Tudor-era witch, Dorea, practically vibrated with indignation. 17 years of theft, and he's been living with muggles while our gold lines the pockets of thieves. Ragnarok cleared his throat pointedly. The portraits have been vocal about the situation since we discovered the irregularities. Harry approached the largest portrait, which showed a couple he instinctively recognized despite never having seen them before. The wizard had his father's unruly hair, but wore robes that suggested the early 20th century. The witch beside him had kind eyes and a gentle expression, though her face was currently set in lines of cold anger. "Fleamont and Euphemia Potter," Harry said, not really asking. "Your grandparents," Euphemia's portrait confirmed, her painted voice heavy with sorrow. "We died too young to see you born, but we've watched from here as our legacy was stolen piece by piece. The families we trusted, the alliances we forged, all perverted into theft." Fleamont's portrait leaned forward. "Show him the records, Goblin. Show him exactly which families have been feeding off Potter gold for 17 years. Ragnarok opened another ledger, this one bound in what looked like dragon hide. The pages were covered with transfer records, each entry meticulously documenting the movement of funds from Potter accounts to various family vaults. The systematic theft began on October 31st, 1981, Ragnarok said, his voice taking on the cold precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. 3 hours after your parents' death was confirmed, the first unauthorized transfers began. Harry stared at the dates and amounts, the sums so large they seemed meaningless, but it was the names of the receiving accounts that made his blood run cold. "Malfoy," he read aloud. "Black. But that can't be right. Sirius would never." "Not Sirius Black," Ragnarok clarified grimly. These transfers went to the main Black family vault, controlled by whoever held the lordship after Sirius was imprisoned. That would have been his cousin, Bellatrix Lestrange, acting through her husband's name. Harry continued reading, his voice growing steadier as his shock transformed into fury. "Avery, Burke, Carrow, Flint, Greengrass, Lestrange, Macmillan, Knott, Parkinson, Rowell, Selwyn, Travers, Yaxley. 13 of the sacred 28 families, Ragnarok confirmed. All families whose members were known Death Eaters or Death Eater sympathizers. All families who suddenly found themselves much wealthier after your parents' death." "But how?" Harry demanded. "How could they access Potter vaults? What authority did they have?" Ragnarok turned to another section of the ledger, revealing official documents bearing ministry seals. "Emergency wartime provisions," he said, his tone suggesting the words tasted foul. "Legislation that allowed the ministry to place orphaned estates under temporary guardianship to prevent them from falling into Dark Lord's hands. In practice, it meant certain ministry officials could authorize transfers for the safety of the assets." Harry studied the authorization forms, noting the signatures at the bottom. Some names he recognized from his years in the wizarding world, officials who had held respected positions, some even considered war heroes. "They used the war as cover," he said, understanding finally dawning. While everyone was focused on fighting Voldemort, these families were systematically looting the estates of their victims. "Precisely," Ragnok confirmed, "and they were very careful about it. The thefts were spread over years, disguised as legitimate transfers for vault maintenance, security upgrades, or temporary relocations. Any one transaction might have seemed reasonable. Taken together, they represent the largest theft in Gringotts history." The fourth chamber contained something that made Harry's heart race. Detailed genealogy records showing the complex web of relationships that had made the Potter inheritance so vast. Marriage alliances between ancient families, blood pacts sealed with magical contracts, lordship inheritances that passed through female lines when male heirs died out. "Your mother's sacrifice didn't just save your life, Mr. Potter," Ragnok explained, gesturing to a particularly complex family tree that traced connections between dozens of pure-blood families. "It bound you to magical contracts that have been building Potter wealth and influence for centuries. Through her blood, you have legitimate claims to lordships that most of these families thought extinct." Harry traced the lines connecting his name to houses he'd never heard of, seeing how the deaths of distant cousins and the marriage of long-dead aunts had gradually consolidated power and wealth into the Potter line. "This is why they had to steal it," he realized. "If I'd known about these connections, if I'd claimed these lordships when I came of age." "You would have been the most powerful lord in wizarding Britain," Euphemia's portrait confirmed. "More powerful than any single family since the days of Merlin himself, which is precisely why they couldn't allow you to discover the truth." The fifth chamber held what Ragnok called the evidence vault, documents, photographs, and magical recordings that detailed every aspect of the theft. As Harry watched, a pensive memory played out, showing a nighttime meeting between several figures in Death Eater masks, their conversation clearly audible as they planned the coordinated looting of orphaned estates. "We've been gathering evidence for months," Ragnok explained as the memory faded. "Every transfer, every forged authorization, every false document. It's all here. Under Goblin law, this constitutes not merely theft, but an act of war against the Goblin nation itself." Harry looked up sharply. "War?" The funds in this vault included deposits from Goblin-owned mining operations, proceeds from Goblin-forged artifacts, and investment partnerships between the Potter family and Goblin clans, Ragnok said, his black eyes glittering dangerously. "By stealing from the Potters, these families also stole from us. That makes this a matter of Goblin honor." As they stood in the evidence chamber, surrounded by proof of 17 years of systematic theft, Harry felt something fundamental shift inside him. The boy who had grown up believing himself unwanted and penniless was gone, replaced by someone who understood the true scope of the injustice that had shaped his life. "What do we do now?" he asked. Ragnok's severe features curved into an expression that was definitely a smile, though not a pleasant one. "Now, Mr. Potter, we begin calling in debts, and in the Goblin nation, theft from our vaults carries a very specific penalty." The vault tour had revealed more than hidden chambers and stolen gold. It had revealed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of wizarding society. As they made their way back toward the surface, Harry knew that the comfortable illusion of post-war peace was about to be shattered by a reckoning 17 years in the making. Harry stared at the list of names Ragnarok had provided, each one representing a family whose inheritance had been systematically looted alongside his own. The parchment felt heavier than it should have, weighted with 17 years of carefully hidden crimes. 3 names stood out to him immediately. Fellow students he'd known at Hogwarts, young people who should have been living very different lives if their birthrights hadn't been stolen. "I need to speak with them," Harry said, folding the list carefully. "They deserve to know what's been done to them." Ragnarok's expression remained impassive. "Be cautious, Mr. Potter. Some may not welcome the news. A comfortable lie is often easier to bear than an uncomfortable truth." But Harry was already thinking about how to approach his former classmates. Neville Longbottom's name topped the list of affected heirs, and Harry felt a familiar surge of protective anger as he considered what the shy, forgetful boy he'd known had been denied. The Leaky Cauldron's fireplace network provided the easiest way to send messages, and by evening, Harry had arranged to meet Neville at the 3 Broomsticks the following day. Hannah Abbott and Susan Bones had agreed to join them, though neither knew why Harry had requested the meeting. He'd kept his message deliberately vague. Too much had been stolen for too long to risk the information being intercepted. The 3 Broomsticks felt different in winter, without the warmth of Hogwarts students filling every table. Madame Rosmerta had aged visibly since the war, her once bright smile now carrying shadows that spoke of too many friends lost, and too much rebuilding left undone. Harry arrived early and claimed a corner table, positioning himself where he could see the entire pub while keeping their conversation private. Neville arrived first, and Harry was struck again by how much the war had changed him. Gone was the round-faced boy who'd trembled in potions class. This Neville stood taller, carried himself with quiet confidence, and bore the subtle scars that marked him as a survivor of the Battle of Hogwarts. But when he spotted Harry, his face lit up with the same genuine warmth that had made him such a loyal friend during their darkest times. "Harry!" Neville crossed the pub with quick strides, grasping Harry's hand in a firm shake. "Good to see you. How are you holding up? I heard you've been working on the reconstruction efforts in Diagon Alley." "I'm well," Harry replied, though the weight of what he'd discovered made the words feel hollow. "And you? I know you've been helping with the memorial gardens at Hogwarts." Neville's expression grew more serious. "Someone needs to make sure they're remembered properly. All of them." He settled into the chair across from Harry. "Your message was mysterious, though. What's this all about?" Before Harry could answer, Hannah Abbott and Susan Bones arrived together, their voices carrying traces of the conversation they'd been having outside. Both women had matured since their school days, though they still carried themselves with the distinctive bearing of Hufflepuff loyalty and determination. "Potter," Susan said with a slight smile as she took her seat, "this is becoming quite the reunion. Though I have to admit, your owl was rather cryptic." Hannah settled beside Susan, her expression curious but slightly wary. "We've been wondering what could be so important that you'd call us all together like this. It's not exactly a social gathering, is it?" Harry took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. The direct approach seemed best. These were people who had fought beside him, who deserved the truth without embellishment. "I've discovered something about our families," he began carefully. "Something that's been hidden since 1981. Our inheritances, all of our inheritances, have been systematically stolen." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the pub seemed to fade as his words settled over the group. "Stolen? Neville's voice carried a note of confusion. "Harry, I don't understand. My family doesn't have... we've never been wealthy." "That's exactly the point," Harry said, pulling out the copies of documents Ragnok had provided. "Neville, your family is one of the Sacred 28. The Longbottoms have held lordships and managed estates for centuries, but after your parents were attacked and hospitalized, someone used their incapacitation to loot the family vaults." Neville stared at the documents Harry spread across the table, his face cycling through disbelief, shock, and growing anger. This says the Longbottom estate was worth over 2 million galleons in 1981. "And most of it was transferred out within 6 months of your parents' attack," Harry confirmed grimly, "while you were being raised by your grandmother, believing your family was barely scraping by." Susan leaned forward, studying the papers with the sharp attention that had made her one of the better students in their defense against the dark arts classes. "Hannah, look at this. The Abbott family holdings were almost as extensive." Hannah's hands trembled slightly as she read the inheritance records that bore her family name. "I don't understand. My father ran a small apothecary. We lived above the shop. How could we have had estates and lordships?" "Because someone made sure you never knew about them," Harry said, his voice growing harder as he spoke. "The same people who made sure I grew up with the Dursleys, thinking I was a burden they were forced to bear out of obligation. The same people who convinced Neville he was a near squib from a barely notable family." Susan's jaw tightened as she read through the transfer records. "These names: Parkinson, Avery, Burke. These are families whose children we went to school with. Their parents stole our inheritances and used the money to live in luxury while we struggled," Neville finished, his voice hollow. "My grandmother scraped together every knut to send me to Hogwarts. She wore the same robes for decades, said the family fortune had been lost during the First War, all while these families were spending Longbottom gold." Harry watched his friends process the magnitude of the theft, recognizing the same progression of emotions he'd experienced in Ragnok's office. The shock gave way to understanding, and understanding gave way to a cold, purposeful anger. "The pattern is clear," Susan said, her voice taking on the clinical tone she'd used when analyzing particularly complex spells. They targeted families with young heirs, incapacitated heirs, or heirs who were otherwise vulnerable. Children who wouldn't know to question their circumstances. Hannah looked up from the documents, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "My father worked himself to death, trying to provide for our family. He died believing he'd failed to give me the life I deserved, all while our rightful inheritance was sitting in other families' vaults." "How many others?" Neville asked quietly. "How many families were targeted?" Harry consulted Ragnok's list. 23 lordships in total. 13 families from the Sacred 28 were involved in the thefts, targeting estates belonging to families whose heirs were convenient victims. "Convenient victims," Susan repeated, her voice bitter. "Children whose parents were dead, adults who were incapacitated, families scattered by the war. They picked us because we couldn't fight back." "But we can fight back now," Neville said, and Harry heard an echo of the young man who had stood against Voldemort in the final battle. "We're not children anymore. We know the truth." Hannah nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "What do we do? How do we get justice for what they stole from us? From our families?" Harry felt a surge of pride as he looked at his friends, these young people who had been systematically cheated and impoverished, but who were now ready to fight for what was right. "Gringotts is conducting a full audit. Under Goblin law, they have the authority to recover stolen assets and pursue justice against the thieves. And the Goblin nation takes theft very seriously, Susan observed. I remember that from our history of magic classes. Goblin justice tends to be thorough. Thorough and permanent, Neville agreed. My grandmother used to tell stories about what happened to wizards who tried to cheat goblins in the old days. As they sat together, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that had shaped their entire lives, Harry felt something fundamental shift in the dynamics between them. They were no longer just school friends reuniting after the war. They were victims of the same crime, united by shared injustice and the promise of justice to come. There will be others, Hannah said thoughtfully. Other families who don't even know they've been robbed. People who grew up believing they were from poor, wizarding families, never knowing their birthright was stolen. Then we find them, Harry said simply. We make sure everyone knows the truth, and we make sure the families responsible face consequences for what they've done. Susan raised her butterbeer in a mock toast. To justice delayed, but not denied. The others followed suit, their voices joining in quiet determination. To justice delayed, but not denied. As they drank, Harry felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. What had started as a personal discovery was becoming something larger, a mission to expose a conspiracy that had reshaped the entire post-war wizarding world. The boy who had defeated Voldemort was about to discover that some enemies wore respectable faces and hid behind ancient family names. But this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. This time, he had allies who understood exactly what had been stolen from them and what they were fighting to reclaim. The investigation was no longer just about Harry Potter's inheritance. It was about justice for an entire generation of victims who had been systematically cheated out of their birthrights while their tormentors lived in luxury built on stolen wealth. And as Harry looked at the faces of his friends, determined, angry, and ready for battle, he knew that this fight would be different from the war against Voldemort. This time, they would use the law, the truth, and the Goblin nation's thirst for justice. This time, the thieves would face the consequences of their crimes. The evidence was damning in its precision. Harry sat in Ragnarok's office, studying transaction records that painted a clear picture of the Malfoy family's central role in the inheritance theft conspiracy. Each document bore the meticulous detail that made Goblin record-keeping legendary, and what they revealed made Harry's blood run cold. The pattern begins here, Ragnarok said, his gnarled finger tracing a line of entries dated November 1981. 1 month after your parents' death, Lucius Malfoy began making what he termed emergency asset protection transfers from various orphaned estates. Harry leaned forward, studying the amounts. The sums were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of galleons moved from Potter accounts, Longbottom vaults, and a dozen other family holdings, all flowing into Malfoy coffers under the guise of protective custody. Emergency asset protection, Harry repeated, his voice tight with anger. He was robbing us while claiming to protect our money. Indeed. And notice the timing, Ragnarok continued, turning the page to reveal another series of transactions. Each transfer occurred during periods of maximum chaos, after Death Eater attacks, during ministry investigations, when families were too grief-stricken or terrified to monitor their financial affairs closely. The next set of documents showed something even more troubling. Ministry authorizations bearing official seals, allowing the transfers under wartime emergency provisions, and at the bottom of each authorization, in the flowing script of wizarding bureaucracy, was the same signature. Lucius Malfoy, Special Advisor to the Minister for Magic. He used his ministry position, Harry said, understanding flooding through him. Lucius wasn't just stealing, he had the legal authority to do it. Precisely. And when Lucius fell from favor after the Dark Lord's first defeat, the operation continued through other means. Ragnok turned to another section, revealing transfers dated through the 1990s. Notice how the signature changes here, but the account destinations remain the same. Harry studied the later documents, recognizing the elegant handwriting of Narcissa Malfoy. She took over when he couldn't use his ministry connections anymore. The Black family inheritance proved particularly lucrative, Ragnok said grimly. When Sirius Black was imprisoned, and later when he died, Narcissa Malfoy claimed authority over the Black estate as the only respectable heir. She systematically liquidated centuries of Black family wealth. "But Sirius left everything to me," Harry protested. "I'm his heir." According to Goblin records, yes. But according to Ministry records, Ragnok produced another document, this one bearing the Ministry's official seal. Narcissa Malfoy successfully petitioned to have Sirius declared mentally incompetent due to his imprisonment in Azkaban, and later had his will declared invalid due to his status as a fugitive. Legally, she became the administrator of the Black estate. Harry stared at the legal documents, feeling sick. While he'd been fighting for his life against Voldemort, the Malfoys had been systematically stealing his inheritance through carefully manipulated legal proceedings. "How much?" he asked quietly. Ragnok consulted his ledger. From the Black estate alone, nearly 3 million galleons, plus properties, artifacts, and investment portfolios worth several million more. Combined with the thefts from other estates, the Malfoy family has stolen approximately 12 million galleons over 17 years. The number was so large it seemed meaningless. Harry tried to imagine what 12 million galleons could have done, the lives it could have improved, the families it could have helped, the futures it could have secured for the orphaned children who had been its rightful heirs. "We need to confront them," Harry said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "They need to know we've discovered what they've done." Ragnok's black eyes glittered with approval. "I have already taken the liberty of scheduling a meeting. The Malfoy family will be here this afternoon, ostensibly for a routine audit of their own accounts. They have no idea what we've discovered." The Malfoy family arrived at Gringotts with their characteristic air of aristocratic entitlement. Lucius swept through the marble halls with his walking stick clicking against the stone, his long platinum hair flowing behind him like a banner. Narcissa followed with the proud bearing that marked her as Black family nobility, while Draco trailed behind, his pale features set in the familiar expression of bored superiority that Harry remembered from their school days. Harry waited in Ragnok's office, positioned where he could see the family as they were escorted through the corridors. At 18, Draco looked older than his years, marked by the war in ways that showed in the careful way he held himself and the shadows around his grey eyes. But he still carried himself with the unmistakable arrogance of inherited privilege. "The Malfoy family as requested," the Goblin clerk announced, ushering them into the office. The moment Lucius spotted Harry, his composed expression faltered. Those cold grey eyes narrowed dangerously, and his hand tightened on his walking stick. Narcissa's reaction was more controlled, a slight tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible straightening of her already perfect posture. Draco's response was the most honest. His pale face went even paler, and he shot a quick, questioning glance between Harry and his parents. "Potter," Lucius said, his drawling voice carrying all the disdain Harry remembered. "How unexpected. I was under the impression this was a routine financial meeting." "Oh, it is," Harry replied, his voice perfectly pleasant. "Just not routine for the reasons you think." Ragnok gestured for the family to sit, though Lucius remained standing, his posture radiating controlled menace. "Mr. and Mrs. Malfoy, Mr. Draco Malfoy, thank you for coming. We have discovered some irregularities in various account transfers that require clarification." "What sort of irregularities?" Narcissa asked, her voice maintaining the cool composure that had served the Black family for generations. But Harry caught the slight tremor in her hands as she smoothed her robes. Ragnok opened the first ledger, turning it so the family could see the transaction records. These transfers, spanning from 1981 to the present, showing substantial funds moving from orphaned estates into Malfoy accounts. We need clarification on the authorization for these transactions. Lucius barely glanced at the ledger before waving his hand dismissively. "Ancient history, Goblin. Those were emergency protective measures during wartime, perfectly legal under ministry provisions." "Emergency protective measures," Harry repeated, his voice cutting through the office like ice. "Is that what you call stealing from orphaned children?" Draco shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between his father and Harry. "What is he talking about, Father?" "Nothing that concerns you, Draco," Lucius snapped, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Ragnok turned to another page, revealing the systematic liquidation of the Black estate. "Mrs. Malfoy, these records show you claiming authority over the Black family inheritance after your cousin Sirius's death. However, our records indicate a valid will leaving the estate to Mr. Potter." Narcissa's composure cracked slightly. Sirius was a blood traitor and a fugitive. His will had no legal standing. As the only respectable heir, the responsibility fell to me to preserve the family legacy. "Preserve it?" Harry's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "You liquidated everything. The house, the artifacts, the investment accounts. You sold off centuries of Black family history and pocketed the proceeds." "How dare you?" Lucius began, stepping forward with his walking stick raised. "Sit down," Ragnok commanded, his voice carrying the authority of Goblin law. "You are in Gringotts now, under Goblin jurisdiction. You will conduct yourself accordingly." Lucius sat, but his grey eyes burned with barely contained fury. Draco looked between his parents and Harry, understanding beginning to dawn on his pointed features. The money, our fortune, where did it really come from? "Draco, be silent," Narcissa hissed, but her son ignored her for the first time in his life. "No, I want to know," Draco said, his voice gaining strength. "All these years, you told me we were one of the oldest, most respected families in Wizarding Britain. You said our wealth came from ancient investments and careful management. Was any of that true?" Harry felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for his former rival. Whatever else Draco might be, he was also an 18-year-old discovering that his entire life had been built on stolen wealth. Ragnok consulted another ledger. According to our records, the Malfoy family's pre-1981 wealth was substantial, but not exceptional. Perhaps 800,000 galleons in various accounts and properties. Today, those accounts hold over 13 million galleons. 13 million, Draco repeated, his voice hollow. And how much of that came from what you're accusing my parents of? Approximately 12 million galleons can be directly traced to unauthorized transfers from orphaned estates, Ragnok replied with goblin precision. Draco stared at his parents, his pale face cycling through disbelief, understanding, and finally, disgust. You stole from orphans, from children who had lost their parents in the war. We preserved assets that would have been lost or mismanaged, Lucius said coldly. We maintained the proper order of wizarding society when others failed in their responsibilities. You stole from me, Harry said quietly, but his voice carried clearly through the office. While I was sleeping in a cupboard under the stairs, wearing hand-me-down clothes and believing I was unwanted, you were living in luxury paid for with my family's gold. You were adequately cared for, Narcissa said, but even she seemed to realize how weak the argument sounded. Adequately cared for? Harry's composure finally cracked. I was starved, locked in my room, treated like a servant, and all while you were spending my inheritance on manor houses and fine robes and whatever luxuries you felt you deserved. Draco flinched, as if Harry had struck him. The pale young man seemed to be seeing his childhood through new eyes. Every expensive gift, every fine meal, every luxury he'd taken for granted, all paid for, with stolen wealth. What happens now? Draco asked quietly, looking directly at Harry rather than his parents. Ragnarok answered before Harry could speak. Under Goblin law, theft from our vaults carries severe penalties. The stolen assets will be recovered, with interest and penalties. The thieves will face justice according to Goblin tradition. Lucius's face went white. You cannot threaten us with Goblin justice. We are British wizards, subject to British law. The crimes occurred in Goblin territory, against Goblin-protected accounts, Ragnarok replied implacably. Goblin law takes precedence, and Mr. Potter, as the primary victim, has already authorized us to pursue full recovery and justice. As the meeting dissolved into threats and legal arguments, Harry found himself watching Draco, who sat silent and pale, staring at his hands. The young man who had grown up believing himself superior to everyone around him was learning that his entire life had been built on theft and lies. For the first time since he'd learned about the conspiracy, Harry felt something other than anger. Looking at Draco's devastated expression, he felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and unexpected sympathy. The Malfoy family had stolen more than money. They had stolen futures, opportunities, and the basic dignity of knowing one's true place in the world. But in doing so, they had also poisoned their own legacy, building their prosperity on a foundation that was now crumbling beneath them. The investigation had found its primary targets. Now came the harder part, deciding what justice should look like for crimes that had shaped an entire generation's understanding of their place in the wizarding world. The house in suburban London looked utterly ordinary from the outside, a modest two-story home with a small front garden, indistinguishable from dozens of others on the quiet street. Harry checked the address twice before approaching the front door, still finding it difficult to believe that this unassuming residence housed the only surviving member of the most ancient and noble house of Black. Andromeda Tonks answered the door herself, and Harry was struck immediately by the unmistakable Black family features, the aristocratic bone structure, the proud bearing, the dark hair that marked her as sister to Bellatrix and Narcissa. But where her sisters had carried themselves with cold superiority, Andromeda's face showed warmth and the kind of strength that came from choosing principle over privilege. "Mr. Potter," she said, her voice carrying traces of the refined accent that marked pure-blood nobility, though softened by years away from that world. "Please come in. Your message was intriguing." The interior of the house reflected its owner's complicated heritage. Modest furniture sat alongside a few pieces that were clearly valuable heirlooms, artifacts that had somehow survived Andromeda's dramatic break from her family. Harry noticed a Black family crest on a silver tea service, incongruous among the comfortable middle-class surroundings. "Thank you for seeing me," Harry said, as they settled in a cozy sitting room. "I know this must be difficult to discuss, but I've discovered something about your family's inheritance that you need to know." Andromeda's expression grew guarded. "The Black family inheritance. Mr. Potter, I was disowned decades ago. Whatever happened to the family wealth after I married Ted is none of my concern." "It should be," Harry replied gently, "because what happened affects far more than just the Black family, and as Sirius's heir, it affects me directly." At the mention of Sirius, Andromeda's composure faltered slightly. Sirius. Yes. I heard he left you everything in his will. Though I confess I was surprised the Ministry honored it, given his status as a fugitive. They didn't, Harry said bluntly. That's part of what I need to tell you. The Ministry declared Sirius mentally incompetent and his will invalid. Narcissa successfully claimed authority over the entire Black estate. Andromeda went very still. Narcissa claimed the estate, but she chose to marry into another family. She took the Malfoy name. Apparently that didn't matter when it came to claiming black gold, Harry said, producing the documents Ragnarok had provided. According to these records, she systematically liquidated everything. Grimmauld Place, the family artifacts, centuries of accumulated wealth, even the investment portfolios that had been growing for generations. Andromeda studied the papers, her face cycling through disbelief, understanding, and finally, a cold fury that reminded Harry powerfully of her cousin Sirius in his darkest moods. 3 million galleons, she read aloud. The Black family estate was worth 3 million galleons when Sirius died. More, actually. That's just the liquid assets. The properties, artifacts, and investments pushed the total value closer to 6 million. Harry watched her face carefully. Andromeda, your family was one of the wealthiest in Wizarding Britain. If you hadn't been disowned, I would have been entitled to a portion as Sirius's heir, she finished quietly, or at the very least, as a surviving family member. She looked up at Harry, and he saw tears gathering in her dark eyes. Do you know what Ted and I lived on after I was disowned? His muggle job as a handyman. We scraped together enough to get by, but there were times when I wondered if I'd made the right choice. Harry felt a familiar surge of anger at the injustice of it all. You made the choice to follow your heart instead of your family's prejudices. You shouldn't have been punished for that. But I was, Andromeda said, her voice growing stronger. And now you're telling me that while Ted worked himself to exhaustion trying to provide for us, while we worried about every galleon we spent, Narcissa was living in luxury, paid for with Black family gold that was stolen, Harry finished firmly. From you, from me, from everyone who had a legitimate claim to it. Andromeda stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked her modest back garden. There's something else you need to know, Mr. Potter. Something about Sirius's death that's been bothering me for 2 years. Harry's attention sharpened. What do you mean? Sirius wrote to me, you know, after he was cleared of betraying your parents, before he died. We'd begun corresponding again. Carefully, since he was still in hiding, but... She turned back to face Harry. His last letter arrived just days before he died in the Department of Mysteries. He was excited about something. He said he'd discovered evidence about his family's finances that would shake the foundations of wizarding society. The blood seemed to drain from Harry's face. Evidence about Black family finances. He said he'd been investigating discrepancies in the family accounts, irregularities that dated back to his imprisonment. He was planning to contact Gringotts to demand a full audit. Andromeda's voice grew quiet. And then, within the week, he was dead. Harry stared at her, pieces of a larger picture beginning to fall into place. You think his death wasn't accidental? I think, Andromeda said, carefully, that Sirius Black was getting too close to discovering the same theft you've uncovered, and I think certain people had very good reasons to want him silenced before he could expose what they'd done. The implications hit Harry like a physical blow. He'd always blamed himself for Sirius's death, believing that his reckless decision to go to the Department of Mysteries had led directly to his godfather's murder. But if Andromeda was right, "They killed him," Harry said, his voice hollow. "They murdered him to keep him from discovering the theft." "I can't prove it," Andromeda admitted. "But the timing, the fact that he was actively investigating the same crimes you've now uncovered, it seems like quite a coincidence." Harry thought about that night in the Department of Mysteries, about Sirius falling through the veil after being struck by Bellatrix's curse. He'd always assumed it was a killing curse gone wrong, or perhaps a stunning spell that had sent Sirius tumbling to his death. But what if it had been deliberate? What if Bellatrix had known exactly what that veil was and had targeted Sirius specifically? "Bellatrix was Narcissa's sister," Harry said slowly. "If Narcissa was orchestrating the theft of the Black Estate, then Bellatrix would have been her natural ally," Andromeda finished. "They may have been married into different families, but they never stopped being sisters, and they both had reason to want Sirius silenced." The room felt suddenly colder. Harry had spent 2 years carrying the guilt of Sirius's death, believing himself responsible for leading his godfather into a trap. But if that trap had been designed not just to capture Harry, but to eliminate the one person who could expose a massive theft conspiracy. "There's more," Andromeda continued, returning to her chair. "After Sirius died, I tried to claim his body for proper burial. I was denied. They said the veil had consumed him entirely. But I've always wondered if that was true, or if certain people simply wanted to ensure there could be no investigation into the exact circumstances of his death." "Who denied your request?" "The Ministry, specifically the Department of Mysteries. But the paperwork came through the Office of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes." Andromeda's expression grew grim. "Signed by an official who, according to my research, received a substantial anonymous donation to his personal vault just days after Sirius's death." Harry felt the world shifting around him as he understood the full scope of what had been done. They didn't just steal our inheritances, they murdered anyone who got too close to discovering the truth. "And they nearly succeeded completely," Andromeda said. "If you hadn't stumbled onto this through your own inheritance issues, the truth might have stayed buried forever." They sat in silence for several moments, the weight of revelation settling over them. Finally, Harry spoke. "What do you want to do about it?" Andromeda's smile was sharp and predatory, an expression that would have been perfectly at home on Bellatrix's face, though motivated by entirely different purposes. "I want justice, Mr. Potter. For Sirius, for Ted, for my daughter Nymphadora, who died fighting a war while the people responsible for prolonging it lived in luxury bought with stolen gold." "The goblins are pursuing full recovery under their law," Harry said. "That includes criminal penalties for the thieves." "Good. But I want more than that." Andromeda leaned forward, and Harry saw the full fury of the Black family bloodline blazing in her dark eyes. "I want everyone to know what really happened. I want the whole wizarding world to understand that their heroes and their respected pure-blood families built their post-war prosperity on the backs of orphaned children and grieving families." "That could be dangerous," Harry warned. "These people have killed to protect their secret. They won't hesitate to kill again." "Then we'd better make sure we have enough evidence to protect ourselves," Andromeda replied grimly. "And enough allies to ensure the truth comes out, even if something happens to us." As Harry left Andromeda's modest home, his mind was reeling with the full implications of what he'd learned. The inheritance theft wasn't just about money. It was about murder, conspiracy, and a level of corruption that reached into the highest levels of wizarding society. Sirius hadn't died because of Harry's recklessness. He'd died because he'd gotten too close to exposing a criminal conspiracy that had shaped the entire post-war wizarding world. And now Harry carried not just the responsibility of recovering stolen wealth, but the burden of ensuring that his godfather's murder was not forgotten or forgiven. The investigation had become something much larger than financial fraud. It had become a quest for justice that would either expose the truth or destroy everyone involved in the attempt. But as Harry walked through the London streets, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Sirius's death, a sense of purpose that went beyond simple revenge. This wasn't just about Harry Potter anymore. It was about ensuring that the people who had stolen, murdered, and corrupted in the name of pure-blood supremacy finally faced the consequences of their crimes. The boy who had defeated Voldemort was about to discover that some forms of evil were more subtle but no less dangerous than Dark Lords and killing curses. And this time, the battle would be fought not with wands and spells, but with truth and the inexorable justice of Goblin law. The burrow looked exactly as Harry remembered it, a ramshackle collection of rooms that defied both gravity and architectural logic, held together by magic and the fierce love of the family within. But as he approached the familiar crooked house, Harry found himself seeing it through new eyes. Every patched wall, every hand-me-down visible through the windows, every sign of the Weasley family's legendary poverty now carried different implications. Arthur Weasley met him at the garden gate, his balding red hair catching the late afternoon sunlight, and his face wearing the same expression of genuine warmth that had made Harry feel welcome from his very first visit. At 48, Arthur looked older than his years. The lines around his eyes spoke of financial worries and the stress of raising 7 children on a ministry clerk's salary. "Harry!" Arthur's handshake was firm and enthusiastic. "Molly's got tea ready, and Bill's here for the week before he goes back to Egypt. Your message said this was important?" "It is," Harry replied, following Arthur up the winding path to the house. "It's about your family's place in the sacred 28, and why certain people left you alone when they were stealing from everyone else." Arthur's step faltered slightly. "The sacred 28? Harry, we've never paid much attention to that nonsense. Blood purity politics and all that. Not really our cup of tea." But Harry caught the note of uncertainty in Arthur's voice, the way his eyes darted toward the house, as if weighing how much his family should know. Molly Weasley bustled out of the kitchen as they entered, her plump form wrapped in a flour-dusted apron, and her red hair escaping from a hastily pinned bun. The warm smile that had always made Harry feel like part of the family was tinged with concern as she looked between him and her husband. "Harry, dear, you look thin," she said, immediately moving to the stove. "Sit down. I'll have sandwiches ready in just a moment. Bill's in the sitting room. He came home early when Arthur told him you needed to speak with all of us." Bill Weasley emerged from the sitting room at the sound of his name, and Harry was struck again by how different the eldest Weasley son looked from the rest of his family, where his parents and siblings bore the comfortable, slightly shabby appearance of their modest circumstances. Bill carried himself with the confidence of someone who had seen the world beyond Britain's shores. His long red hair was tied back with what looked like genuine dragon leather, and his earring caught the light as he moved. "Potter," Bill said with a slight smile, extending his hand. "Been a while since we've had a proper conversation. I hear you've been asking questions about family inheritances and goblin banking procedures." The comment was casual, but Harry caught the sharp intelligence behind Bill's eyes. As a Gringotts employee, Bill would have access to information that most wizards never saw. "You've heard about the investigation," Harry said, not really asking. "Hard not to, working where I do," Bill replied. "The Goblin Nation has been vocal about certain irregularities they've discovered, and your name has come up frequently in those discussions." Molly set tea and sandwiches on the kitchen table, though Harry noticed her hands trembled slightly as she poured. "What's this about inheritances, Harry? Surely there's no trouble with your vault." "Not my vault specifically," Harry said, accepting the cup of tea gratefully. "But I've discovered something that affects all the sacred 28 families, including yours." Arthur and Molly exchanged a look that Harry couldn't quite interpret. Bill, however, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Go on," Bill said. Harry pulled out the familiar documents that had become his constant companions over the past weeks. For the past 17 years, someone has been systematically stealing from the orphaned estates of sacred 28 families. Millions of galleons have been transferred from families like the Potters, the Longbottoms, the Abbotts, the Bones, all flowing into the accounts of families like the Malfoys, the Averys, the Parkinsons. Molly's face went pale. "Stealing from orphans, but that's monstrous." "It is," Harry agreed. "But here's what I don't understand. The Weasley family is listed in the Sacred 28. You should have been targets for the same theft. But according to every record I've seen, your family accounts were left completely alone." Arthur set down his teacup with careful precision. "Harry, I think you may be overestimating our holdings." "Am I?" Harry spread out the genealogical charts Ragnarok had provided. "The Weasley family has been pure blood for centuries. You have claims to at least 3 minor lordships through marriage alliances, plus the family estate that should have been passed down through the male line. Even allowing for normal expenses, your family should have been worth several 100,000 galleons." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Bill spoke. "How much do you think we're worth now, Harry?" "According to your father's ministry records, about 800 galleons total." Bill's laugh was bitter. "Try 80 galleons, and that's on a good month." Harry stared at the family that had welcomed him like a son, seeing them with new understanding. "You're not just poor, you're destitute. Someone did steal from you. They just did it so gradually, so carefully, that you never realized it was happening." "Or," Arthur said quietly, "we knew exactly what was happening, and we let it happen." The words hung in the air like a curse. Molly's face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands. Bill's expression had gone cold and dangerous. "Dad," Bill said, his voice very controlled, "what did you do?" Arthur looked older than his 48 years as he answered. "The same thing my father did, and his father before him. We paid the blood traitor tax." "The what?" Harry demanded. 30 years ago, when Voldemort was first rising to power, certain families received invitations to contribute to the cause, Arthur explained, his voice hollow. Pure blood families were expected to show their support through financial donations. But families like ours, families that refused to embrace blood purity ideology, faced a choice. Molly looked up, her eyes red with tears. Pay the tax, or be declared enemies of the pure blood movement. "What kind of tax?" Harry asked, though he was beginning to understand. 90% of our annual income, Bill said flatly, every year, for decades, paid to a pure blood heritage foundation that supposedly used the money to preserve wizarding culture. Harry felt sick. The same families that were stealing from orphaned estates were also extorting money from blood traitor families. "It was protection money," Arthur said simply. "Pay up, keep quiet, and your family wouldn't be targeted for more direct forms of persecution. Don't pay, and face the consequences." "What consequences?" Bill's smile was sharp and humorless. "Ask the Fenwick family. Oh wait, you can't. They refused to pay in 1979. Their entire family was found dead 3 days later, killed by unknown assailants who were never caught. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. So the Weasley family poverty wasn't just circumstance. You were being systematically drained by the same people who were stealing from everyone else. "But we were alive," Molly said fiercely. "Our children were safe. They could go to Hogwarts, make friends, live normal lives. We paid the price for that safety." "And the goblins knew," Bill added, his voice carrying the weight of professional knowledge. "Gringotts tracks every transaction, every transfer. They knew exactly where our money was going and why. But Goblin law doesn't interfere in what they classify as voluntary donations, even when everyone knows they're nothing of the sort." Harry studied the three Weasleys, understanding now why they'd all looked uncomfortable when he'd arrived. "How long have you known about the inheritance thefts?" Bill answered. "I've suspected for years. Too many wealthy families suddenly got wealthier after the war, while families with young or vulnerable heirs stayed poor. But suspecting and proving are different things." "And you never said anything." "To whom?" Arthur asked. "The ministry officials who were authorizing the transfers? The Wizengamot members who were benefiting from them? Harry, half the people in positions of authority were either perpetrators or victims, and the victims who knew were too scared to speak up." "Scared of what?" Molly's voice was barely above a whisper. "Scared of losing what little they had left. Scared of their children being targeted. Scared of ending up like the families who tried to fight back and simply disappeared." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the old clock that tracked the Weasley family's whereabouts. Harry stared at these people he loved, understanding finally why they'd always seemed so grateful for small kindnesses, so protective of their children, so determined to fight against the dark arts, despite their apparent lack of resources. "You've been victims all along," Harry said. "Just a different kind of victim. And now you're investigating the people who've been terrorizing families like ours for decades," Bill said. "Which puts you in considerable danger and puts us in an impossible position." "What do you mean?" "I work for Gringotts," Bill explained. "My job gives me access to the financial records of every major wizarding family in Britain. If the perpetrators realize that I've been helping with this investigation, they'll target your family for revenge," Harry finished. "Or worse," Arthur said grimly. "The people we're talking about have killed to protect their secrets. They won't hesitate to kill again." As Harry looked around the kitchen table at the Weasley family, this family that had shown him more love and acceptance than his blood relatives ever had, he felt the full weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. By pursuing this investigation, he wasn't just risking his own safety. He was potentially destroying the fragile protection that families like the Weasleys had bought with decades of financial suffering. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. Arthur and Molly exchanged another long look, a conversation passing between them in the way of couples who had weathered decades together. Finally, Arthur spoke. "We want you to finish what you started, Harry. But we want you to do it right. Don't just expose the thefts. Expose the entire system. The extortion, the threats, the murders. Make sure everyone understands that this wasn't just about greed. It was about power and control, and the systematic oppression of anyone who dared to stand against pure blood supremacy. And we want justice," Molly added, her voice carrying the fierce protectiveness that had made her legendary among those who knew her. "Not just financial recovery, but real justice. For all the families who've suffered, all the children who grew up poor because their parents were being bled dry, all the people who disappeared because they tried to fight back." Bill leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "There's something else you should know, Harry. The Goblin Nation isn't just interested in recovering stolen assets. They're interested in bringing down the entire network that made these crimes possible, and they've been planning this for a long time." "What do you mean?" "Goblins don't forgive theft. Ever. They've been documenting every transaction, every transfer, every suspicious pattern for decades. They've been waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst, to bring down the whole system." Bill's smile was predatory. "Congratulations, Harry. You're that catalyst." As Harry left the burrow that evening, his understanding of the investigation had fundamentally changed. This wasn't just about recovering stolen inheritances. It was about dismantling a system of financial terrorism that had shaped the post-war wizarding world. The Weasley family's poverty wasn't a sign of their irrelevance to the conspiracy. It was proof of how thoroughly the conspiracy had succeeded in controlling and intimidating anyone who opposed it. But it was also proof that resistance was possible. The Weasleys had survived decades of financial oppression while maintaining their principles and protecting their children. They'd found ways to fight back, even when fighting back seemed impossible. And now, with the Goblin Nation's backing and the truth finally coming to light, they would have their chance for justice. The boy who had defeated Voldemort was about to discover that some victories required more than magical power. Some victories required patience, planning, and the kind of courage that showed up not in dramatic battles, but in the quiet decision to keep fighting even when the cost seemed unbearable. This time, Harry wasn't fighting alone. This time, he had allies who understood exactly what they were fighting against, and exactly what they stood to lose if they failed. The Romanian Dragon Sanctuary sprawled across a valley surrounded by snow-capped mountains, its boundaries marked by ancient wards that shimmered faintly in the winter air. Harry followed Charlie Weasley through the sanctuary's entrance, marveling at the controlled chaos of dragon handlers going about their daily routines. The air smelled of sulphur and magic, with an underlying hint of something wild and dangerous that made his instincts sharpen. "She's been here since June," Charlie explained, his stocky frame moving with the confident ease of someone who had spent years working with creatures that could incinerate him without thinking twice. "Showed up half dead and completely traumatized. Took us months just to get her to eat regularly." Harry adjusted his dragon-hide gloves, grateful for Charlie's insistence on proper protective gear. At 26, the second eldest Weasley son had filled out from the Quidditch-playing teenager Harry remembered, his arms and shoulders bearing the muscular build that came from wrestling with creatures weighing several tons. "How did you know she was the Gringotts dragon?" Harry asked, as they approached a massive enclosure set apart from the others. "Ukrainian ironbellies are distinctive," Charlie replied, his freckled face serious. "And this one, she bears very specific scars. Chains, Harry. Decades of chains around her neck and legs, marks that come from being kept underground in unnatural conditions. Plus, she arrived exactly when you'd expect if a dragon had flown here from London after escaping Gringotts." They stopped at a reinforced viewing platform that overlooked the largest enclosure Harry had ever seen. And there, basking in a patch of December sunlight, lay the most magnificent and terrible creature he had ever encountered. The Ukrainian ironbelly was massive beyond comprehension, easily 100 feet from snout to tail, with metallic grey scales that shifted like liquid mercury in the light. Her deep red eyes, clouded with age and the cataracts that had left her half-blind, tracked their movement with ancient intelligence. "She's beautiful," Harry breathed, then immediately felt foolish for the comment. "She's deadly," Charlie corrected, but his voice carried affection rather than warning. "And she's also the oldest dragon I've ever encountered. Ukrainian ironbellies can live for centuries, and this one, Harry, she's been guarding Gringotts' vaults for over 50 years. The implications hit Harry like a physical blow. 50 years. She would have seen everything, Charlie confirmed grimly. Every authorized entry, every unauthorized breach, every suspicious transaction. Dragons don't forget, Harry. Their memories are perfect, especially when it comes to threats to their territory. And Gringotts' vaults were her territory. Exactly. Which is why what she has to tell us is going to shake the foundations of Wizarding Society. Charlie led Harry down from the viewing platform to a heavily warded consultation chamber built into the side of the enclosure. Through thick crystal windows, they could see the dragon's massive head as she shifted position to observe them. The process requires a specialized form of legilimency, Charlie explained, setting up an array of magical instruments Harry didn't recognize. Dragons think differently than humans. Their memories are layered, associative, tied to scent and territorial instincts. But under Goblin law, dragon testimony is considered absolutely reliable. Goblin law. Dragons are goblin-forged creatures in a sense, not literally, but goblins have been working with dragons for millennia. They understand dragon psychology, dragon magic, dragon memory patterns. A dragon can't lie, Harry. They literally don't have the cognitive framework for deception. Charlie activated the instruments, and Harry felt the air in the chamber shift as powerful magic engaged. The dragon's massive eye, visible through the crystal window, began to glow with a soft, silvery light. "She's agreed to share her memories," Charlie said quietly. "But Harry, what you're about to see, it's going to be difficult. Dragons remember everything, including things humans would prefer to forget." The chamber filled with silvery mist, and suddenly Harry was no longer standing in Romania. He was underground in the familiar corridors of Gringotts, but seeing them through different eyes, eyes that perceived heat signatures, magical auras, and the complex scent markers that dragons use to navigate their world. The first memory was from 1981. The dragon was younger then, her scales brighter, her vision clear. She lay in the depths of Gringotts, guarding the high-security vaults with perfect vigilance. And then came the intruders. But they weren't intruders in the traditional sense. They wore official robes, carried proper authorization documents, spoke the correct passwords. The dragon's instincts screamed danger, but her magical conditioning compelled her to allow access. Harry watched through the dragon's memory as figures in ministry robes systematically looted vault after vault. He recognized some of the faces, younger versions of people he'd seen at ministry functions, respected officials who had built their post-war careers on reputations for integrity and service. They had the right authorizations, Harry said, his voice hollow. The dragon couldn't stop them because they were following proper procedures. "Keep watching," Charlie said grimly. The memories shifted forward in time. 1983, 1985, 1987. A steady parade of authorized thefts, each one documented by the dragon's perfect recollection. The same faces appeared again and again, along with new ones as the conspiracy expanded. But it was the memory from 1995 that made Harry's blood run cold. Lucius Malfoy descended into the depths of Gringotts, his platinum hair gleaming under the magical lights. But he wasn't alone. Behind him walked a figure in a hooded cloak, and when the figure turned slightly, Harry caught a glimpse of red eyes and snake-like features. "Voldemort," Harry whispered. "Voldemort was in Gringotts in 1995. "During his return," Charlie confirmed. "And watch what they're doing." The memory showed Voldemort and Malfoy entering multiple vaults, not just stealing from them, but placing objects within them. Dark artifacts, cursed items, and in one case, what looked suspiciously like a Horcrux container. They were using the stolen vaults as storage facilities, Harry realized, hidden in plain sight, protected by Goblin security. And the dragon saw all of it, Charlie said. Every placement, every retrieval, every visitor. She's been an unwilling witness to 17 years of systematic corruption. The memories continued, showing the gradual escalation of the conspiracy. What had begun as opportunistic theft had evolved into a sophisticated network of corruption that reached into every level of wizarding society. The dragon had watched respected Wizengamot members authorize transfers, seen ministry officials forge documents, observed the careful coordination that had kept the conspiracy hidden for nearly 2 decades. The final memory was from May 1st, 1998, the night Harry, Ron, and Hermione had broken into Gringotts to steal Hufflepuff's cup. But the dragon's perspective revealed details Harry had never known. There were others in the bank that night, Harry said, watching figures moving through corridors they hadn't explored. People who weren't supposed to be there. Clean-up crew, Charlie said. The same people who had been stealing from the vaults realized that your break-in was going to trigger a comprehensive audit. They were destroying evidence, moving assets, covering their tracks. But they missed something. They missed the dragon's memories, and under Goblin law, those memories constitute legal testimony. As the silvery mist faded and they returned to the consultation chamber, Harry felt the weight of what they'd discovered. The dragon's testimony didn't just prove the inheritance thefts. It revealed a conspiracy that had used Gringotts itself as a base of operations for 17 years. "What happens now?" Harry asked. Charlie's expression was grim. "Now we take this evidence back to the goblins, and then we prepare for war." "War?" "Harry, what you've just seen isn't just financial fraud. It's a systematic infiltration of goblin territory by hostile forces using their own security systems against them. The Goblin Nation considers that an act of war." The dragon shifted outside the window, her massive head turning toward them. Even through the crystal barrier, and despite her clouded vision, Harry felt the weight of her ancient gaze. "She wants something," he realized. Charlie nodded. "She wants justice. Dragons are territorial creatures, Harry. For 50 years, she watched intruders violate her domain while she was magically compelled to allow it. She wants the people responsible to face the consequences. And under Goblin law, the penalty for theft from goblin-protected vaults is death. The penalty for using goblin security systems to facilitate ongoing criminal enterprises." Charlie's smile was not pleasant. "Let's just say the goblins have some very creative ideas about justice." As they prepared to leave the sanctuary, Harry looked back at the Ukrainian Ironbelly one final time. The ancient dragon watched their departure with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of centuries and the memory of every crime committed in her presence. She's not just a witness, Harry realized. She's a victim too. 50 years of forced servitude, magically compelled to guard vaults while watching them be systematically looted. Charlie agreed. She's got as much reason to want justice as anyone. The flight back to London gave Harry time to process what he'd learned. The dragon's testimony had transformed their investigation from a financial audit into something much larger. Proof of a conspiracy that had violated goblin sovereignty and used one of their most sacred creatures as an unwilling accomplice to widespread theft. But it had also given them something invaluable, evidence that was absolutely unassailable under magical law. Dragon memories couldn't be falsified, couldn't be questioned, and couldn't be dismissed by corrupt officials. The people responsible for 17 years of systematic theft were about to discover that some crimes carried consequences that extended far beyond the wizarding justice system they had so carefully corrupted. The dragon's testimony would be the key to bringing down the entire network and ensuring that the victims finally received the justice they deserved. As London's lights came into view below them, Harry felt a cold satisfaction settling in his chest. The investigation had found its smoking gun, and the ancient Ukrainian Iron Belly would finally have her chance to see the intruders who had violated her domain face the full weight of Goblin justice. The boy who had once ridden a dragon to escape Gringotts was about to use dragon testimony to ensure that the people who had corrupted it faced consequences they never imagined possible. The war room deep within Gringotts bore no resemblance to the elegant banking halls above. Here, beneath layers of ancient stone and goblin wards, Ragnarok had assembled what looked like the headquarters of a military campaign. Maps covered every surface, marked with locations, dates, and connecting lines that traced patterns of financial crime across nearly 2 decades. Ledgers stood in towering stacks, their pages filled with evidence that painted a picture of conspiracy so vast it defied comprehension. Harry stood before the largest map, which showed the British Isles dotted with coloured pins representing different types of criminal activity. Red pins marked known Death Eater attacks from both wars. Blue pins showed inheritance thefts. Green pins indicated families that had been extorted through blood traitor taxes. And yellow pins marked suspicious deaths that had never been properly investigated. The pattern was unmistakable. Every major Death Eater offensive coincided with increased inheritance theft, Ragnarok said, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The Longbottom attack, the McKinnon massacre, the destruction of the Bones family, all followed within days by massive unauthorized transfers from the victims' accounts. Harry traced the timeline with his finger, seeing how the red and blue pins clustered together like wounds in the landscape of Wizarding Britain. They weren't just targeting families for their blood status or their opposition to Voldemort. They were targeting them for their wealth. Precisely. And notice how the pattern changes after 1981. Ragnarok indicated a shift in the pin distribution. After the Dark Lord's first defeat, direct attacks became rare. But the inheritance thefts accelerated. Because they no longer had the cover of open warfare, Harry realized, they had to be more subtle. Indeed. Which brings us to this. Ragnarok opened a ledger, bound in what looked like black dragon hide. The financial records of Bartemius Crouch, Jr., traced through 18 different account numbers and shell companies. Harry leaned over the ledger, studying entries that went back to the early 1980s. Even before his death in 1995, Barty Crouch Jr. had been operating what amounted to a criminal banking network, moving stolen funds between accounts, laundering money through legitimate businesses, and coordinating payments to what the records euphemistically called operational assets. He was the financial coordinator, Harry said, understanding dawning. Crouch Jr. managed the money side of the Death Eater operations. More than that, he was the bridge between the legitimate wizarding establishment and the Death Eater underground. Ragnarok turned to another section of the ledger. Notice these payments to ministry officials, Wizengamot members, even employees here at Gringotts. Crouch Jr. was buying influence, corrupting officials, building a network of people who would authorize transfers without asking inconvenient questions. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Harry recognized names from his years in the wizarding world, respected officials, war heroes, people whose reputations had been built on their supposed opposition to dark magic. How many people were compromised? Harry asked. At the height of the operation, perhaps 200 individuals across the ministry, the Wizengamot, and various financial institutions. Not all were willing participants. Some were blackmailed, others threatened. A few were simply incompetent and easily manipulated. But the effect was the same. Ragnarok opened another ledger, this one showing transaction patterns from 1994 and 1995. And then something changed. The thefts became more aggressive, more desperate, larger amounts, taken more frequently, with less regard for maintaining cover. Harry studied the dates, connecting them to his own memories. 1994 was when Voldemort began his return. The Triwizard Tournament, the graveyard. Precisely. Someone knew the Dark Lord was coming back, and they accelerated their activities to prepare for it. Ragnarok's black eyes glittered with cold intelligence. But look at what happened after Crouch Jr.'s death in 1995. The pattern changed dramatically. Where before the thefts had followed a careful, methodical pattern, after 1995 they became chaotic, opportunistic, almost desperate. They lost their coordinator, Harry said. Without Crouch Jr., the network started to fragment. Exactly. Which is why the operation became sloppier, more visible, easier for us to trace. Ragnarok turned to a new section of documents. And it's why we were able to uncover this. The documents he revealed made Harry's blood run cold. They were operational plans, written in the precise handwriting that marked ministry bureaucracy, detailing something called Project Consolidation. "What is this?" Harry asked, though he was already beginning to understand. "A comprehensive plan to seize control of the entire wizarding economy," Ragnarok replied grimly. "Written in 1995, shortly before Crouch Jr.'s death. The plan called for the systematic elimination of all major pure-blood families that opposed the Death Eater ideology, with their assets to be transferred to loyal families." Harry read through the documents, feeling sick as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. It wasn't just about stealing from orphans or extorting blood traitors. It was about reshaping wizarding society by controlling its wealth. The sacred 28 families were the targets, Harry said, consulting the list from his research. Not because they were all opposed to Voldemort, but because they controlled most of the wizarding world's hereditary wealth. Precisely. Eliminate the opposition families, steal their assets, and use that wealth to fund a new social order with Death Eater families at the top. Ragnarok pointed to another section of the documents. Notice how the plan specifically identifies which families were to be preserved and which were marked for consolidation. The preserved list was a who's who of known Death Eater families and sympathizers: Malfoy, Avery, Carrow, Flint, Greengrass, Parkinson, Selwyn, Yaxley. The consolidation list included the Potters, Longbottoms, Abbotts, Bones, and a dozen other families whose children Harry had known at Hogwarts. But the plan failed, Harry observed. Voldemort was defeated again. The plan failed, but the network survived. Look at these post-war transactions. Ragnarok opened yet another ledger, this one covering the period from May 1998 to the present. Even after the Dark Lord's final defeat, the thefts continued. The network had become self-sustaining, motivated as much by greed as by ideology. Harry studied the recent transactions, seeing how the conspiracy had evolved. Without the ideological drive of supporting Voldemort's return, the operation had become purely predatory. Wealthy families, stealing from anyone they could, using the infrastructure of corruption that Crouch Jr. had built. They couldn't stop, Harry realized. Even after the war ended, they couldn't stop stealing. Addiction, Ragnarok said simply. The same psychological compulsion that drives gambling or substance abuse. They had become addicted to the wealth and power that came from theft, and they couldn't conceive of returning to their previous circumstances. The Goblin moved to the final display, a timeline that showed the acceleration of theft activities in the months following Voldemort's defeat. Notice the pattern here. As soon as it became clear that there would be no Death Eater victory, the participating families began frantically consolidating their stolen assets. They knew their time was limited. Because they knew eventually someone would investigate, Harry said. Or because they knew the Goblin Nation would eventually demand an accounting. We have been patient, Mr. Potter, but Goblin patience is not infinite. The theft from our vaults, the corruption of our employees, the violation of our sovereignty, these crimes demand justice. Ragnarok moved to the center of the room, where a scale model of Gringotts sat surrounded by documents representing every transaction, every theft, every corrupt authorization from the past 17 years. The dragon's testimony provided the final piece of evidence we needed, he continued. But what we have uncovered goes far beyond simple financial fraud. This was a systematic attempt to destroy the traditional structure of wizarding society and replace it with a plutocracy controlled by Death Eater families. Harry looked around the war room, taking in the overwhelming evidence of conspiracy, corruption, and theft. What's our next move? Now, Mr. Potter, we end this. Tomorrow, the Goblin Nation will formally demand the return of all stolen assets, with interest and penalties. The families involved will have 48 hours to comply. And if they refuse? Ragnarok's smile was sharp and predatory. Then they will discover that Goblin justice extends far beyond the confines of our bank. The network that Crouch Jr. built has been operating on Goblin territory, using Goblin resources, corrupting Goblin employees. Under our law, that makes every participant an enemy of the Goblin Nation. What does that mean, practically? It means, Mr. Potter, that the people who have been stealing from you and your fellow victims are about to face consequences they never imagined possible. Goblin justice is thorough, impartial, and final. As Harry left the war room, his mind reeling from the scope of what they had uncovered, he understood that the investigation had revealed something far more dangerous than inheritance theft. They had exposed a criminal network that had nearly succeeded in restructuring wizarding society according to Death Eater ideology, using financial manipulation instead of direct violence. The conspiracy had survived Voldemort's defeat, evolved beyond its original purpose, and continued operating for months after the war's end. But now, faced with the combined force of Goblin justice and the testimony of their own victims, the network was about to discover that some crimes carried consequences that extended far beyond the wizarding legal system they had so carefully corrupted. The boy who had defeated the Dark Lord was about to witness the destruction of the financial empire that had sought to replace Voldemort's reign of terror with a reign of economic oppression. And this time, there would be no escape, no last-minute reprieve, no political maneuvering to avoid justice. The Goblin Nation had spoken, and their verdict was final. The network that had stolen from orphans, extorted from blood traitors, and murdered anyone who threatened their operations was about to face the full weight of Goblin law. And Harry Potter, the boy who lived, would finally see his parents' killers, not just Voldemort, but the entire system that had profited from their deaths, face the justice they deserved. The Great Hall of Gringotts had been transformed into something Harry had never seen before, a formal Goblin tribunal chamber. Ancient banners bearing Goblin clan symbols hung from the vaulted ceiling, their gold threads catching the light of floating braziers that burned with magical flames. Tiered seating rose on 3 sides of the chamber, filled with goblins whose expressions ranged from coldly professional to barely contained fury. At the center of the hall stood a dais, carved from what appeared to be a single massive emerald, its surface inscribed with runic symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering firelight. Behind an ornate bench of black marble sat 5 goblins in ceremonial robes, their faces marking them as the highest authorities in the Goblin Nation. This was no mere banking dispute. This was a formal trial under Goblin law. Harry took his seat in the witness section, noting the heavy magical wards that surrounded the chamber. There would be no escape from this room, no political maneuvering, no last-minute interventions from corrupted ministry officials. Here, in the heart of Goblin territory, only Goblin law applied. Ragnok entered through a side door, his usual business robes replaced by formal ceremonial dress that marked his status as chief prosecutor. His weathered features showed no emotion, but Harry caught the glint of satisfaction in his black eyes. "The tribunal will come to order," announced the central figure on the bench, her voice carrying the authority of centuries. "We are here to address charges of systematic theft from Goblin-protected vaults, corruption of Goblin employees, and violation of Goblin territorial sovereignty." A door at the far end of the chamber opened, and the defendants entered under Goblin escort. Lucius Malfoy strode into the chamber with his characteristic arrogance intact, his long platinum hair flowing behind him, and his walking stick clicking against the marble floor. At 44, he still carried himself with the aristocratic bearing that had made him a power in wizarding society, but Harry noticed subtle signs of strain around his cold grey eyes. Narcissa followed a step behind, her posture perfect and her expression composed. At 43, she retained the refined beauty that had made her the prize of the Black family, though her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her robes. "Lucius Malfoy, Narcissa Malfoy," the chief Goblin continued, "you stand accused of crimes against the Goblin nation spanning 17 years. How do you answer these charges?" Lucius stepped forward, his drawling voice carrying its usual note of superiority. "This tribunal has no authority over British wizards. We demand to be tried under wizarding law in wizarding courts." The chamber erupted in what could only be described as Goblin laughter, a sound like grinding stone mixed with the clash of metal. The chief Goblin raised her hand for silence. "The crimes occurred in Goblin territory, against Goblin-protected assets, using Goblin banking systems," she replied coldly. "Goblin law takes precedence. You will answer the charges." Ragnok approached the bench, carrying an ornate chest that Harry recognized from their vault expeditions. "The prosecution presents evidence of systematic theft totaling 12,473,000 galleons, stolen from 47 different accounts over a period of 17 years. He opened the chest, and documents began floating out in organized streams, arranging themselves in the air above the tribunal. Each document glowed with the soft light that marked Goblin authentication spells. These records could not be falsified or disputed. "We deny all charges," Narcissa said, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "Any transfers from the accounts in question were authorized under proper ministry procedures during wartime emergencies." "Indeed." The chief Goblin's tone was dangerously soft. "Ragnok, please display the authorization documents." Another stream of papers joined the first, these bearing ministry seals and official signatures, but as they hung in the air, the signatures began to change, revealing the magical forensics that Goblin banking used to detect forgery. 37 forged authorizations, Ragnok announced. 15 coerced signatures obtained under duress. 8 legitimate authorizations that were exceeded by amounts totaling over 2 million galleons. Lucius's composure cracked slightly. "Those were administrative errors, not deliberate theft." "Administrative errors," the chief Goblin repeated. "Then perhaps you can explain this." The floating documents reorganized themselves, displaying the careful coordination between thefts and Death Eater activities that Harry had seen in the war room. Every major theft coincided with attacks on the families being robbed, Ragnok continued. The Longbottom assault was followed within hours by the transfer of 800,000 galleons from Longbottom accounts to Malfoy vaults. The McKinnon massacre preceded the liquidation of their entire estate by 3 days. The pattern is unmistakable. Correlation is not causation, Narcissa said, but her voice had lost its steady confidence. True, the chief goblin agreed, which is why we also present this. The documents shifted again, revealing correspondence between Lucius and various Death Eater operatives. Harry recognized some of the handwriting from his years battling Voldemort's followers. Communications detailing target selection, timing of attacks, and distribution of stolen assets, Ragnarok announced, including this particularly illuminating exchange regarding the Potter family estate. A letter materialized in the air, its text visible to everyone in the chamber. Harry read his parents' names and felt his hands clench into fists as the cold calculation behind their murder became clear. The Potter accounts present exceptional opportunity, Lucius's younger handwriting proclaimed. Substantial liquid assets plus lordship, claims that could provide ongoing revenue. Recommend priority targeting for elimination. Suggested time frame, October 31st, provides optimal operational cover. The chamber fell silent except for the crackling of the magical braziers. Even the goblin spectators seemed stunned by the casual brutality revealed in the correspondence. "You planned my parents' murder for their money," Harry said, his voice cutting through the silence like ice. Lucius turned toward him, and for a moment the aristocratic mask slipped entirely, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "Your parents died because they opposed the natural order. Their wealth was merely a beneficial consequence." "Mr. Potter," the chief goblin said gently, "please restrain yourself. Justice will be served according to goblin law." Harry forced himself to remain seated, though every instinct screamed at him to hex Lucius where he stood. Narcissa stepped forward, her composure finally cracking. "We can make restitution, full financial recovery, plus damages. Surely that would satisfy goblin justice." "Restitution," the chief goblin mused. "An interesting concept. Tell me, Mrs. Malfoy, how do you propose to make restitution for 17 years of stolen childhoods? How do you compensate a generation of young people who grew up in poverty while you lived in luxury bought with their inheritance?" "Money," Narcissa said desperately. "We can pay whatever amount." "You cannot pay with money that was stolen in the first place," Ragnarok interrupted. "According to our calculations, the Malfoy family's legitimate pre-theft assets totaled approximately 800,000 galleons. Your current holdings exceed 14 million. 85% of your wealth belongs to other families." "The Black family inheritance," Narcissa began, "was stolen through fraudulent legal proceedings after arranging the murder of the rightful heir," the chief goblin finished. "Yes, we are aware of your role in Sirius Black's death." The accusation hung in the air like a curse. Harry felt his lightning scar give a faint throb. Not from Voldemort's presence, but from his own barely contained fury. "We have committed no murders," Lucius said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. "Perhaps not directly," Ragnarok agreed. "But conspiracy to commit murder carries the same penalties under goblin law, as does theft, corruption, and violation of territorial sovereignty." The chief goblin consulted a scroll that had appeared at her elbow. "The tribunal finds the defendants guilty on all charges. The penalty under goblin law is forfeiture of all assets and exile from goblin territory in perpetuity." "Exile?" Narcissa's voice cracked. "You may no longer enter any goblin-controlled establishment, use any goblin-manufactured products, or conduct any financial business requiring goblin services. In the wizarding world, this amounts to economic death." "You cannot enforce such a sentence on British wizards," Lucius protested, but his arrogance was gone, replaced by growing panic. "Watch us," the chief goblin replied simply. Ragnok stepped forward with another document. As of this moment, all Malfoy accounts are frozen. All assets derived from theft are confiscated. The Malfoy name is added to the Goblin Exclusion Registry, which is recognized by every magical financial institution in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. What does that mean? Harry asked. It means, Ragnok said with evident satisfaction, that they cannot buy, sell, trade, or conduct any business that requires magical banking. They cannot access their vaults, cannot use Gringotts services, cannot even exchange currencies. They are financially exiled from magical society. The implications hit the Malfoys like physical blows. In the wizarding world, where everything from property ownership to simple purchases required interaction with goblin-controlled financial systems, they had just been sentenced to effective poverty. "This is not justice," Lucius snarled, his composure finally shattering completely. "This is revenge." "No," Harry said, standing slowly. "Revenge would be giving you the same treatment you gave the families you robbed. Justice is making sure you can never hurt anyone else." The Chief Goblin nodded approvingly. "Mr. Potter speaks truth. Justice is not about punishment. It is about restoration and prevention. The stolen assets will be returned to their rightful owners. The victims will receive compensation for their losses, and the perpetrators will be prevented from committing similar crimes in the future. All stolen funds have been traced and will be redistributed within 30 days, Ragnok announced. Additionally, the Goblin Nation is instituting new security measures to prevent similar crimes. No future inheritance transfers will be processed without direct verification with all living heirs. As Goblin guards moved to escort the Malfoys from the chamber, Narcissa turned back toward Harry, her proud bearing finally broken. "My son," she whispered. "Draco had no part in this. Please." "Your son will inherit your legitimate assets," the Chief Goblin said, not unkindly. "Approximately 40,000 galleons and the Malfoy name, though that name now carries complications. He may rebuild his family's reputation through his own actions." The guards led the Malfoys away, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet chamber. Harry watched them go, feeling not triumph, but a deep, weary satisfaction. Justice had been served, not through violence or revenge, but through the impartial application of law. "It is finished," the Chief Goblin announced. "Let the record show that Goblin territorial sovereignty has been upheld, stolen assets have been recovered, and the criminals have been appropriately sentenced." As the tribunal dissolved and the goblins began filing out of the chamber, Harry remained seated, processing what he had witnessed. The investigation that had begun with a simple audit had culminated in the complete destruction of the conspiracy that had shaped his childhood and the childhoods of countless others. But more than that, it had demonstrated that justice was possible, even against seemingly untouchable enemies, when the right laws were applied by the right authorities. The boy who had defeated Voldemort had now seen financial terrorists face consequences under Goblin law, and for the first time since learning about the theft of his inheritance, Harry felt that the scales of justice had finally begun to balance. The Malfoys' reign of financial terror was over. Now came the harder work of rebuilding what they had destroyed. The restoration ceremony took place in the same great hall where the Malfoy trial had concluded just 1 week earlier. But the atmosphere could not have been more different. Where the tribunal had been a place of judgment and consequence, this gathering celebrated justice, fulfilled, and futures reclaimed. Harry stood with his fellow victims at the center of the chamber, each of them holding documents that represented far more than mere financial assets. These were certificates of restoration, formal recognition of their rightful places in wizarding society, acknowledgement of the crimes committed against them, and most importantly, the keys to futures that had been stolen from them nearly 2 decades earlier. Neville Longbottom stood straighter than Harry had ever seen him, his round face transformed by a confidence that went beyond his post-war growth. At 18, holding the documents that formally recognized him as Lord Longbottom, he looked every inch the heir to one of the most respected pure-blood families in Wizarding Britain. 2.3 million galleons, Neville said quietly, still staring at the figures on his inheritance documentation. Plus 3 estates, a seat on the Wizengamot, and lordship rights dating back to the 13th century. My grandmother never told me. She couldn't have known the full extent of what was stolen. Hannah Abbott clutched her own documents with hands that trembled slightly, her eyes bright with tears she was trying not to shed. The Abbott family holdings had been substantial, not as vast as the Longbottoms or Potters, but enough to transform her life completely. My father worked himself to death trying to provide for our family, she said, her voice thick with emotion. All while our rightful inheritance was sitting in other people's vaults. If we had known. Susan Bones placed a gentle hand on Hannah's shoulder, her own expression cycling between grief and determination. At 18, she had always been the most analytical of their group, and even now she was calculating the broader implications of what they had uncovered. The question is what we do with this knowledge, Susan said. We have our inheritances back. But what about all the other families who don't even know they were robbed? That, said Ragnok, approaching their group with a satisfaction that radiated from his weathered features, is why we are implementing the new protocols. The goblin gestured toward a massive parchment that hung suspended in the air above the ceremony. Covered in text written in multiple languages, English, Gobbledygook, Latin, and what appeared to be ancient runic script, it represented the most comprehensive banking reform in goblin history. The Inheritance Protection Accords, Ragnok announced to the assembled crowd, negotiated between the Goblin Nation and the Reformed Ministry of Magic. Never again will inheritance theft on this scale be possible. Harry studied the document, noting the careful legal language that closed every loophole the conspiracy had exploited. What are the key provisions? First, Ragnok replied, all inheritance transfers must be verified directly with every living heir, regardless of age. No more transfers based solely on ministry authorizations or guardian permissions. Second, added another goblin who had joined their group, all major financial transactions involving inheritance accounts will be subject to mandatory waiting periods and independent review by goblin auditors. And third, Ragnok continued with evident pride, any family that has suffered inheritance theft in the past century may petition for a full audit and restoration at no cost to themselves. The implications were staggering. Harry realized they were looking at reforms that would reshape the entire wizarding economy, making it impossible for another conspiracy like the one they had exposed to succeed. How many families do you estimate were affected? Neville asked. Our preliminary investigations suggest at least 47 families suffered direct theft, Ragnok replied. Another 33 were subjected to various forms of extortion or financial manipulation. In total, approximately 80 families, roughly half of the Sacred 28, plus many smaller pure-blood and half-blood families, were victimized in some way. The number was overwhelming. Harry tried to imagine 80 families living in reduced circumstances, their children growing up believing themselves poor or barely middle class, while their stolen wealth funded the lifestyles of their oppressors. It will take years to sort out all the claims and restorations, Susan observed. Indeed. But the Goblin Nation is committed to seeing justice done completely, Ragnok confirmed. We have established a permanent office for inheritance restoration, staffed by our most experienced auditors. What about the families that benefited from the theft? Hannah asked. Not all of them were willing participants like the Malfoys. Before Ragnok could answer, a voice from behind them provided the response. "Some of us are trying to do what's right." They turned to find Draco Malfoy approaching their group, and Harry was struck by how much his former rival had changed in the week since the investigation began. Gone was the arrogant sneer and casual superiority that had defined him during their school years. At 18, Draco looked older, worn down by the weight of discoveries that had shattered his understanding of his family and his place in the world. "Malfoy," Harry said neutrally, unsure how to respond to this new version of his childhood enemy. "Potter," Draco replied, but without the venom that had once characterized their interactions. "I wanted to apologize for what my family did to yours. To all of yours." The apology hung in the air between them, unexpected and somehow more powerful for its simplicity. "You weren't responsible for your parents' crimes," Neville said quietly. "You were as much a victim as we were, just a different kind of victim." Draco's pale features showed surprise at the compassion in Neville's voice. "I benefited from their crimes. I lived in luxury while you—" He gestured helplessly. "While we grew up thinking we were poor," Susan finished. "But you grew up thinking you were something you weren't. In some ways, the lie was as damaging to you as it was to us." "What will you do now?" Hannah asked, and Harry heard genuine concern in her voice. Draco produced his own set of documents, much thinner than theirs, but bearing the same official seals. "I'm inheriting the legitimate Malfoy assets. About 40,000 galleons and the family name, though." He grimaced. "The name doesn't carry the weight it used to." "Names can be rebuilt," Harry said, surprising himself with the offer of understanding. "It's what you do with them that matters." "I've been thinking about that," Draco replied. "The goblins offered me a chance to participate in the restoration process. Use what I know about my family's operations to help identify other victims, trace stolen assets, make sure everyone gets their rightful inheritance back. And," Susan prompted. "Susan, I accepted. It seems like the least I can do." Draco looked directly at Harry. "I can't undo what my family did to yours, but maybe I can help ensure it never happens to anyone else." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the ceremonial platform. Ministry officials were arriving, not the corrupted bureaucrats who had enabled the conspiracy, but new leadership that had emerged in the wake of the revelations. "The reformed Wizengamot is convening," Ragnok explained. "With the restoration of so many lordships, the composition of wizarding government is about to change significantly." Harry looked around the chamber, taking in the transformed dynamics he was witnessing. Neville would claim the ancient Longbottom seat in the Wizengamot. Hannah and Susan would represent their families' interests in wizarding politics for the first time in decades. Even Draco, working to rebuild his family's reputation, might eventually reclaim a voice in wizarding affairs. "It's not just about the money," Harry realized. "This changes everything about how wizarding society is structured." "Exactly," Ragnok confirmed. "For 17 years, political power has been concentrated in the hands of families that stolen wealth through theft and corruption. Now that power returns to its rightful holders." As the ceremony continued around them, Harry felt a profound sense of completion settling over him. The investigation that had begun with a simple audit had evolved into something far larger, a fundamental restructuring of wizarding society based on justice rather than theft. "What about you, Harry?" Neville asked. "What will you do with all of this?" He gestured toward Harry's documentation, which represented by far the largest restoration: multiple lordships, vast estates, and wealth that made him one of the most powerful individuals in Wizarding Britain. Harry considered the question carefully. Months earlier, he had been working reconstruction in Diagon Alley, content to rebuild the world one building at a time. Now he found himself holding the keys to reshape wizarding society itself. "I think," he said slowly, "I want to make sure this never happens again. Not just through legal protections, but by changing how we think about wealth and power and responsibility." "What do you mean?" Hannah asked. "The families that stole from us used their wealth to buy influence, to corrupt officials, to shield themselves from consequences. What if we used our restored wealth differently? What if we used it to strengthen institutions instead of corrupting them?" Susan's eyes lit up with understanding. "You're talking about using wealth as a force for justice instead of oppression." "Exactly. We have a chance to prove that power doesn't have to corrupt, that wealth can be a tool for protecting people instead of exploiting them." As the ceremony concluded and they prepared to leave the chamber, Harry looked back at his friends, his fellow victims who had become allies in justice. They were all different people than they had been when this investigation began, shaped by the knowledge of what had been done to them and what they had accomplished in response. The boy who had defeated Voldemort had become something new. Not just a war hero, but an agent of systemic change. And around him, a new generation of leaders was emerging, united not by blood purity or inherited privilege, but by shared experience of injustice and a commitment to preventing its repetition. The investigation was complete. The conspiracy had been exposed, the criminals punished, and the victims restored. But more than that, they had laid the foundation for a wizarding world where such crimes would be impossible. As they walked out into the London evening, Harry felt the weight of his restored inheritance in his document case. But more importantly, he felt the weight of responsibility to use what had been returned to him not for personal gain, but for the protection of everyone who might face similar injustice in the future. The war against Voldemort had ended with a single spell in a moment of confrontation. The war against systemic corruption would be fought over years and decades, one reform at a time, one protection put in place, one corrupt system replaced with a just one. But for the first time since learning about the theft of his inheritance, Harry felt confident that this war, too, could be won. Justice had been served. Now came the harder work of building a world where justice was not the exception, but the rule. The restoration was complete. The new order had begun. 3 months after the restoration ceremony, Harry discovered that justice delivered was only the beginning of justice maintained. The reformed wizarding world faced challenges that no tribunal could simply decree away, and the forces of old privilege did not surrender their power gracefully. The first sign of organized resistance came on a cold March morning when Harry arrived at the newly established Office of Inheritance Restoration to find auras stationed outside the building and protective wards shimmering around the entire structure. "What happened?" Harry asked Neville, who was emerging from the building with a grim expression that would have been unrecognizable on his face during their school years. "Someone tried to break into the files last night," Neville replied, his voice carrying the authority that came with his new position as head of victim advocacy. "Third attempt this month. They're getting more sophisticated." Harry studied the damage to the building's facade, noting the scorch marks that suggested someone had tried to blast through the Goblin-reinforced security measures. "Any idea who?" "The same people who've been funding the legal challenges, I'd imagine," Susan Bones said, joining them from the building's main entrance. At 18, she had thrown herself into the legal aspects of the restoration with the same analytical intensity she'd once applied to defense against the dark arts homework. We've identified at least 12 different shell companies attempting to file injunctions against the asset recoveries. The resistance had taken multiple forms. While the Goblin Tribunal's verdicts were final and legally unassailable, the implementation of those verdicts in the broader wizarding world required cooperation from institutions that had been corrupted for decades. Some ministry departments moved slowly on processing the restored lordship claims. Certain Wizengamot members questioned the legitimacy of Goblin law superseding wizarding jurisdiction. A few of the implicated families had fled the country entirely, taking whatever liquid assets they could access before their accounts were frozen. "How is Hannah handling the Wizengamot challenges?" Harry asked as they walked toward the building. "Better than anyone expected," Neville replied with evident pride. "Yesterday she stood up to a 3-hour interrogation about the Abbott family's right to reclaim their ancestral seat. By the end, she had the questioners apologizing for wasting the chamber's time." Hannah Abbott's transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic of all their group. The shy Hufflepuff who had once struggled with confidence now spoke with the authority of someone who had discovered her family's true heritage and refused to be cowed by those who had stolen it. Inside the office, Harry found organized chaos. Dozens of cases were being processed simultaneously. Family trees researched, financial records analyzed, stolen assets traced through decades of transfers. The walls were covered with charts showing the web of relationships between victim families and the conspiracy that had robbed them. "Potter!" called a familiar voice, and Harry turned to find Draco Malfoy emerging from one of the research rooms, his arms full of ledgers and documents. At 18, Draco looked older than his years, the aristocratic arrogance of his youth replaced by something harder and more determined. "Malfoy," Harry replied, still adjusting to this new dynamic between them. "How's the Greengrass investigation going?" "Complicated," Draco said, setting down the ledgers. "The family claims they were coerced into participating, and there's some evidence to support that. But they also clearly profited from assets stolen from the Zabini and Knott families." The Greengrass case represented one of many grey areas the restoration process had uncovered. Not every family that had received stolen assets was an active participant in the conspiracy. Some had been threatened into cooperation, others had been deceived about the source of their sudden wealth, and a few had been used as unwitting fronts for money laundering operations. "What's your recommendation?" Harry asked. "Partial restoration," Draco replied after a moment's consideration. "They return what they can prove was stolen. Keep what they can prove was legitimately obtained or received under duress, and face civil penalties but not criminal charges." It was a nuanced judgment that the old Draco would never have been capable of making. The transformation in his former rival continued to surprise Harry, though he was beginning to understand that the revelation of his family's crimes had shattered more than just Draco's worldview. It had freed him from the burden of living up to corrupted expectations. "The real problem," Susan said, spreading out a map on the central table, "is international complications." The map showed locations across Europe where stolen assets had been moved. Swiss banks, French investment firms, German magical financial institutions. The conspiracy had been sophisticated enough to move money across national boundaries, creating jurisdictional challenges that complicated recovery efforts. "The French are cooperating," Susan continued, "but the Germans are demanding formal treaty negotiations before they'll recognize Goblin legal authority. And the Swiss—" She shrugged helplessly. "The Swiss are being Swiss," Neville finished with dark humor, "banking secrecy laws that would make a Goblin weep with envy." "What about the families that fled?" Harry asked. "Most went to countries without extradition treaties with the Goblin nation," Draco replied. "The Averys are in Eastern Europe somewhere. The Carrows are rumored to be in South America. They took what liquid assets they could access, but the bulk of their wealth was in property and investments that couldn't be moved quickly. Harry studied the international complications map, understanding that they were looking at years of diplomatic negotiations and legal challenges. How much have we actually recovered? 87% of the stolen assets, Susan reported with evident satisfaction. The remainder is either tied up in international disputes or was spent on items that can't be easily liquidated, like the Parkinson family's collection of dark arts artifacts, which the Ministry destroyed years ago. It was better progress than Harry had dared hope for, but he knew that the financial recovery was only part of the challenge. The real test was whether the reformed system could resist future corruption. "What news from Gringotts?" Harry asked. "Ragnarok says the new security protocols are working," Neville replied. "They've caught 17 attempted frauds in the past month alone. Small-scale operations, mostly families trying to inflate their legitimate inheritance claims, but the detection systems are functioning as designed. The security improvements represented a massive undertaking. Every inheritance account in the Goblin banking system had been audited, new verification procedures implemented, and oversight mechanisms established to prevent future systematic theft. The question," Susan said thoughtfully, "is what happens when public attention moves on to other issues? Will we be able to maintain this level of vigilance indefinitely?" It was the question that kept Harry awake at night. The investigation and restoration had succeeded because it had captured public imagination and political momentum. But that attention was already beginning to wane as other issues demanded focus. "That's why we're institutionalizing everything," Harry replied, "building the protections into the system itself, not relying on individual attention or good intentions." Over the following weeks, Harry threw himself into the implementation challenges with the same determination he had once applied to fighting Voldemort. But this enemy was more subtle, not Dark Lords and Death Eaters, but bureaucratic inertia, legal technicalities, and the simple human tendency to forget uncomfortable truths once immediate crises passed. The resistance took many forms. Some was overt, like the attempted break-ins at the Restoration Office or the legal challenges filed by implicated families. But more dangerous was the passive resistance. Ministry departments that processed paperwork slowly, Wizengamot members who found procedural reasons to delay votes, financial institutions that discovered technical complications whenever Goblin auditors requested access to records. "They can't stop us," Hannah observed during one of their weekly coordination meetings, "but they can slow us down and hope we get tired or distracted." "Then we don't get tired," Harry replied simply, "and we don't get distracted." By late spring, the restoration process had achieved a new equilibrium. The major stolen assets had been recovered and redistributed, the worst criminals had been punished or exiled, and the new security measures were preventing future large-scale theft. But more importantly, the young people who had discovered their stolen inheritances were using their restored wealth and influence to reshape wizarding society in fundamental ways. Neville's work in victim advocacy was expanding to cover all forms of institutional injustice. Hannah's legal challenges were establishing precedents that protected the rights of minority families and blood traitors. Susan's research was identifying and correcting decades of corrupted policies across multiple government departments, and Draco's transformation from perpetrator's son to justice advocate had become a symbol of the possibility for redemption and change, even among those who had been raised in privilege built on others' suffering. As Harry stood in the Restoration Office, looking out at London through windows protected by Goblin wards, he realized that they had accomplished something unprecedented. Not just financial recovery or criminal justice, but systemic change that would protect future generations from the crimes that had shaped their own childhoods. The war against Voldemort had ended with a single moment of confrontation. The war against systematic corruption had been won through months of patient work, careful investigation, and the determination to see justice done completely rather than partially. But victory brought new responsibilities. The young people who had reclaimed their stolen inheritances now had the power and platform to prevent future injustices. The question was whether they would have the wisdom and persistence to use that power well. As the sun set over the London skyline, Harry felt confident that they would. They had learned too much and fought too hard to let corruption return to the shadows where it had hidden for so long. The restoration was complete, but the work of justice was never finished. There would always be new challenges, new attempts to subvert the system, new forms of injustice that required vigilance and response. But for the first time since learning about his stolen inheritance, Harry believed that those challenges could be met. The reformed wizarding world had the tools, the institutions, and most importantly, the people committed to ensuring that justice was not just a moment of triumph, but an ongoing way of life. The boy who had defeated the Dark Lord had become something more, a guardian of the systems that protected ordinary wizards from those who would exploit them. And he was not alone in that guardianship. Together, they would ensure that the darkness they had exposed would never again hide in plain sight, protected by respectability and the silence of its victims. The resistance to justice was real, but it was not insurmountable. And every day it grew weaker as the new order grew stronger. Justice had been served, justice would be maintained, and justice would expand to protect others who had not yet found their voice or discovered their stolen heritage. The work continued. The invitation arrived on a crisp October morning in 2003, delivered by a barn owl that waited patiently on Harry's windowsill as he read the elegant script. The 5th annual Restoration Day commemoration would be held at the newly rebuilt Great Hall of the Ministry of Magic, and as one of the founding members of the Inheritance Justice Foundation, his presence was requested for the keynote address. Harry set down the invitation and looked out at the London skyline, noting the changes that 5 years of systemic reform had brought to the wizarding world. Construction cranes dotted the horizon, where new buildings rose to house the expanded agencies tasked with protecting magical citizens' rights. The old Diagon Alley had been rebuilt with Goblin-designed security measures that made theft and fraud nearly impossible, and in the distance, the white marble spires of the reformed Wizengamot building caught the morning light, a symbol of justice built to replace the corrupted chambers where previous generations had been denied their rights. At 23, Harry had grown into his role as what the Daily Prophet called the guardian of wizarding justice. The boy who had once been content to rebuild the world one building at a time now oversaw institutions that protected the inheritance rights of wizarding families across 3 continents. A knock at his door interrupted his morning reflection. "Come in," he called, expecting to find his assistant with the day's schedule. Instead, Neville Longbottom entered, carrying what appeared to be an official ministry document case. At 23, Neville had fulfilled every promise of the courage he'd shown during the war. As the newly elected Minister for Magic, the youngest in history, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to wield power justly. "Harry," Neville said, his warm smile unchanged despite his elevated position. "I wanted to deliver this personally." He handed over the document case, which bore the seal of the International Confederation of Wizards. The final ratification, the Global Inheritance Protection Treaty, is now law in 47 countries. Harry opened the case, scanning the treaty that represented 5 years of diplomatic negotiation. The document established universal standards for inheritance protection, mutual recognition of Goblin banking law, and international cooperation in asset recovery cases. "Even the Swiss signed?" Harry asked with amusement. "Even the Swiss," Neville confirmed. Turns out that Goblin auditors are very persuasive when they're backed by the threat of economic sanctions from the entire magical world. The treaty represented the culmination of efforts that had begun with their investigation of stolen inheritances. What had started as a British problem had revealed similar patterns of corruption in magical communities worldwide, leading to a global reform movement that had transformed how inheritance rights were protected across the international wizarding community. "How are the others doing?" Harry asked. "Susan just won her case at the International Court of Magical Justice," Neville replied with evident pride. "The Romanian government has agreed to return 2 million galleons in assets stolen from British families during the war. And Hannah's education reform bill passed the Wizengamot last week. Magical children from disadvantaged families will now receive inheritance education starting at age 11. The transformation of their former classmates never ceased to amaze Harry. Susan Bones had become the leading international lawyer specializing in inheritance rights, arguing cases before magical courts across Europe. Hannah Abbott had parlayed her own experience of stolen inheritance into a career in magical education, ensuring that future generations would understand their rights and how to protect them. "What about Draco?" Harry asked. "Still running the most successful victim advocacy organization in Europe," Neville replied. His latest report identified corruption in the Hungarian banking system that goes back 30 years. He's become quite the thorn in the side of old, pure-blood privilege. Draco Malfoy's transformation had been the most dramatic of all. The organization he'd founded, Children of Thieves, helped the descendants of both victims and perpetrators understand their family histories and make appropriate restitution. His unique perspective, as someone who had benefited from stolen wealth, made him uniquely qualified to guide others through the complex process of acknowledging past wrongs and working toward justice. "The commemoration this year should be interesting," Neville continued. "We're announcing the completion of the global audit. Every major magical banking institution has been examined, every questionable inheritance transfer investigated. And the results? 237 families have had their stolen assets restored," Neville said, consulting a parchment from his coat. "Total recovery, 43 million galleons, plus properties, artifacts and investment portfolios worth approximately another 60 million, the largest financial justice operation in magical history." The numbers were staggering, but Harry had learned to think beyond mere financial recovery. The real victory was in the institutional changes that made such systematic theft impossible in the future. "The Malfoys?" Harry asked, though he already suspected he knew the answer. "Lucius died in exile 2 years ago," Neville replied quietly. "Narcissa is living quietly in Albania, working as a seamstress under an assumed name. Their exclusion from Goblin territory remains absolute. Even their great-grandchildren will be barred from magical banking unless they make formal restitution for their family's crimes. The Goblin nation's concept of justice extended across generations, ensuring that the benefits of crime could not be passed down to innocent heirs. It was harsh by human standards, but it had proved remarkably effective at deterring future theft." "What about the political impact?" Harry asked, settling into his favorite chair as Neville made himself comfortable. "Complete transformation of the power structure," Neville replied with satisfaction. "The old pure-blood families that built their influence on stolen wealth have been replaced by a more diverse group of leaders. The Wizengamot now includes representatives from families that had been impoverished for generations, but were actually entitled to significant influence. The political changes had been as dramatic as the financial ones. With their stolen wealth recovered, families that had been marginalized for decades were reclaiming their rightful places in wizarding society. The result was a more representative government that reflected the actual composition of magical Britain rather than the narrow interests of a criminal elite. And internationally? Harry asked. The reform movement has spread everywhere magical communities exist, Neville said, his voice carrying the quiet pride of someone who had helped lead a global transformation. The American Magical Congress is implementing inheritance protection measures modeled on our system. The French are conducting their own historical audit, going back 2 centuries. Even the traditionally insular Asian magical communities are beginning to examine their banking practices. The investigation that had begun with Harry's confusion over a routine audit had become a catalyst for worldwide reform. The Goblin banking system, with its meticulous record-keeping and incorruptible memory, had provided the model for financial institutions across the magical world. "There's something else," Neville said, his expression growing more serious. "We've received intelligence about a group of exiled families attempting to establish their own banking system in South America. They're calling it the Pure Heritage Bank and claiming to serve the true magical nobility." Harry felt a familiar stirring of determination. Even after 5 years, there were those who refused to accept that their reign of financial terrorism had ended. "What's our response?" he asked. "The South American magical governments have agreed to deny them operating licenses," Neville replied, "and the Goblin Nation has made it clear that any institution attempting to compete with their oversight authority will face consequences." The Goblin approach to protecting their monetary system had proved remarkably effective. Attempts to establish alternative banking systems outside Goblin oversight had failed consistently, usually within weeks of opening. "Speaking of consequences," Neville continued with a slight smile, "Ragnarok wanted me to give you this." He produced a small wrapped package bearing the seal of the Goblin Nation. Harry opened it to find an ornate key made of what appeared to be mithril, inscribed with runes that seemed to shift in the light. "What is it?" Harry asked. "Honorary key to the Goblin Treasury," Neville explained. "Only the 5th one ever granted to a non-Goblin. It's their way of thanking you for helping restore trust in their banking system." Harry turned the key over in his hands, understanding the magnitude of the honor. The Goblin Nation guarded their financial systems jealously, and recognition like this represented acceptance into their most exclusive circles. "There's a ceremony next month," Neville continued. "Ragnarok wants to formally present you with the title of Friend of the Goblin Nation. Apparently it comes with certain privileges regarding international banking that even most wizarding governments don't enjoy." The conversation was interrupted by another owl at the window, this one bearing the distinctive red sealing wax that marked urgent correspondence from the Inheritance Justice Foundation. Harry opened the message and frowned as he read the contents. "We have a problem," he said. "What kind of problem?" Neville asked, his minister's instincts immediately alert. "Someone's been asking questions about the dragon testimony that helped break the original case," Harry replied, consulting the message, "trying to find ways to discredit or invalidate it." "Who?" "The report doesn't say, but the inquiries are coming through intermediaries in at least 3 different countries. Someone with resources and international connections is trying to find a way to challenge the legal foundation of everything we've built." Neville's expression hardened. "The same dragon whose testimony exposed 17 years of theft? Someone's trying to discredit her?" "Apparently. The theory seems to be that if they can prove dragon testimony inadmissible under human courts, they might be able to challenge the Goblin tribunal verdicts that relied on it. It was a sophisticated legal strategy that revealed the involvement of someone with deep knowledge of both Goblin and wizarding law. More concerning, It suggested that the resistance to reform had evolved from direct opposition to subtle undermining of its legal foundations. "What do we need to do?" Neville asked. "Protect the dragon," Harry replied, already making plans. "And start preparing for the possibility that someone is going to challenge the entire legal framework we've built." As they discussed security measures and legal protections, Harry felt a familiar sense of purpose settling over him. The investigation had ended, the criminals had been punished, and the stolen assets had been restored. But the work of protecting justice was never finished. 5 years later, they faced new challenges from new enemies using new methods. But they also had new tools, new allies, and new institutions designed to resist corruption and protect the innocent. The boy who had defeated Voldemort had grown into a man who understood that some battles were won, not with spells and swords, but with patience, persistence, and the determination to protect systems that served justice rather than power. As Harry prepared for another day of safeguarding the reformed wizarding world, he reflected on how much had changed since that December morning when a simple audit had revealed 17 years of hidden crime. The investigation was complete, but the mission it had revealed, protecting the innocent from those who would exploit them, would continue for as long as there were people willing to do the work. The restoration was finished, the protection was ongoing, and Harry Potter, surrounded by friends who had become allies in justice, was ready for whatever challenges the future might bring. The work continued, and it always would. But for the first time since learning about his stolen inheritance, Harry was confident that the forces of justice were stronger than the forces of corruption. The war for a just magical world had been won. The peace that followed would be vigilantly maintained. And somewhere in the distance, a Ukrainian iron-bellied dragon rested peacefully in her Romanian sanctuary, her ancient memories safe under the protection of friends who understood that some testimonies were too important to ever be silenced. The end was also a beginning. Justice served was justice that must be preserved, protected, and extended to others who had not yet found their voice.